So first of all, good morning, everyone. Good morning is not morning for me, it's afternoon or good evening, wherever you are.
Yeah.
I guess most of you know me, but my name is GIJTR Joseph, and I am the Senior Program Manager for Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean at the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. And I am here today also with my colleagues, Silvia Fernandez from our Global Networks Program Director, Justine Di Maio, Program Manager for Europe and MENA with the Global Networks, Elena Del Hoyo, Global Networks Associate, and Camila Yanzaguano, our Communications Associate, Dario Colmenares, the Program Director for our Global Justice Initiative, and Ashley Nelson, our Communications Director. So on behalf of all of us and the Global Networks team, I'd like to welcome you all to our workshop, Collecting and Centering Communities' Voices. We've been waiting eagerly to have this workshop and to welcome you here. So before I introduce our topic, I'd just like to let our attendees know that we anticipate this workshop lasting about 4 hours. If you wish to submit a comment or a question, you may do so at any time in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. There will be a designated Q&A session towards the end of the webinar. So during that time, or throughout the webinar, you may also raise, in the Q&A, you may raise your hand, but if you wish to speak, we will unmute you at the time of the Q&A. And if you want to post chats, you can use the chat box and write your thoughts. If we do go over slightly, which sometimes happens, please know that this is, and all our virtual programming is recorded and is then made available in our website for future viewing and sharing. Also remember that if your connection is bad, please try turning off your video. And if you have any further technical problems during the meeting, please reach out to coalition@sitesofconscience.org, and we'll do our best to assist you quickly. Okay. And finally, but very importantly, at the end of this session, you will be directed to a survey, which we will be so grateful for all of you if you can fill it, as it's crucial for the evaluation and our future programming to design better and efficient programs for you all. So starting into our programmatic news and introductions, this workshop is taking place under the Global Networks 2022 project, Correcting the Record, One Narrative at a Time. This project aims to expand the impact of sites of conscience in countering hatred, violence, and discrimination in their societies today, and by fostering more inclusive historical narratives. So this builds on the work carried out by the coalition in 2021, which most of you or many of you have participated in, aimed to identify systemic inequities and lay the groundwork for countering stigmatization and discrimination in our communities today. Correcting the Record will amplify members' unique expertise in documentation, oral history, collection, and community engagement to confront what author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie called the single stories, simplistic and often false narratives that exclude the experiences, needs, and voices of minority groups, ultimately contributing to divisive rhetoric, negative stereotypes, discrimination, hatred, and violence. The main objective of the Correcting the Record project is to develop skills and a comprehensive methodology for sites of conscience around the world to build and interpret their repositories in an inclusive, equitable, and holistic manner. We are doing this through peer exchanges, one-on-one mentoring, and global capacity building opportunities such as this workshop, and also by piloting 6 Correcting the Record case studies with sites of conscience in Chile, Brazil, Trinidad and Tobago, Uganda, Mauritius, and Taiwan. In selecting these 6 participant sites, we took into consideration several aspects, from regional diversity to needs, focus, and expertise in the topic at hand, and as well how, through their combined experiences in developing these case studies, we could produce the most comprehensive possible Correcting the Record methodology for our global membership in future. So these 6 sites of conscience are being supported by mentors Lebo Marichane from Constitution Hill, in South Africa, and Radhika from Her Stories in Sri Lanka, to develop these case studies in which they are revisiting their organization's repositories, as well as their practices from collecting and archiving, research, documentation, and preservation, and how they choose to curate, represent, display these repositories in order to identify gaps in their approaches to building and interpreting repositories in an inclusive and equitable and holistic manner. So this collective experience of developing the Correcting the Record case studies will support the development of one-of-a-kind methodology that will be grounded in the practice and expertise of the coalition staff and member sites, and that allows sites of conscience around the world to recalibrate their repositories in order to amplify marginalized voices, promote more inclusive public narratives, and mitigate discrimination and inclusion. Today's workshop, Collecting and Centering Communities' Voices, is the first opportunity for capacity building offered to global members through the Correcting the Record project. It will focus on centering communities' voices through shifting power within our organizations and adopting empowering, sensitive, and non-re-traumatizing approaches to story collection and safeguarding. So throughout the coming 6 months, we'll be sharing project development milestones with global members via our social media and through a peer review meeting in which other sites of conscience with outstanding expertise on the topics at hand will also be called to offer critical input and fresh ideas into the process. So by November 2022, we will have compiled a final methodology, which will be shared during our second global workshop, Correcting the Record. And in that workshop in November, global members will have the opportunity to engage with the Correcting the Record methodology firsthand and offer critical input before we complete our final Correcting the Record toolkit. We hope that through a thorough documentation and evaluation of the project, this Collecting and Centering Communities' Voices workshops and the final Correcting the Record methodology workshop and toolkit, we will produce an essential resource for sites of conscience around the world to correct the record in their repositories. So now, without further ado, I would like to call my colleague Justine De Maio to introduce the next sessions. So Justine, I'll pass the word to you.
Thank you very much, JJ. Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Lebo Marishan. She's the Strategic Support Manager at Constitutional Hill in South Africa, and she's involved in shaping supportive environments that enable the development of African communities and increase civic engagement. She also firmly believes in the strategic use of information communication technologies to center and amplify voices of those that live in the margins. So as one of our 2 Correcting the Record mentors, Lebo will bring insight from the discussion held with sites of conscience currently piloting the Correcting the Record methodology and our own knowledge and practice to guide us on reflections and paths on shifting power within organizations. Lebo, the floor is yours. Just want to say that in the interest of keeping time, we will communicate with you via a chat box to let you know how your presentation timing is going. Lebo.
Thank you, Justine, for the introduction, and hello to everybody. As introduced, I am Lebo, and I'll be giving a presentation on shifting power. Can I have the next slide? In putting together the presentation, I would like to start with the definition of power, which would then be underpinning the work that we are doing in collecting the record, and also just overall centering voices. We picked up a definition by Dr. Martin Luther King, who defined power as the ability to achieve a purpose, and said it's a strength required to bring about social, political, and economic change. And thus, this informed the approach, and it continues to inform the approach that we're taking in working with shifting power. Can I have the next slide? We borrowed from Just Associate this framework that begins to analyze what power is. And the first column you will see looks at a power over, which is power that is seen as infinite. You have it or you don't, and can be used for coercion, force, intimidation, to keep power, and perpetuate injustice, poverty, and inequality. And in our space, we could see it in largely colonial history or present oppressions. Then we move to power within, which focus on finding common ground, build collective strength, mutual support, solidarity, collaboration, build bridges. This you can see in examples of coalitions, movements, advocacy work that we do. Power two, which is believe in each individual's potential and their ability to make a difference. This we can see in civic education, leadership development for advocacy. Power within, a person's sense of self-worth and self-knowledge, capacity to imagine and have hope. And this we see in grassroots campaigns, storytelling, much largely in the work that we do. Can I have the next slide, please? In the context of correcting the record, we identified 6 major sources of power. The first one that we recognize is people and citizens mobilization. That's where you can find a lot of power with collaborations and mobilizing citizens, conscientizing them around an issue. We also recognize that there's power in narratives and knowledge. The power of constitutional guarantees, which is a formal form of power of collective memory and networking, power in solidarity, power of moral or ethical convictions. And we'll demonstrate in the next slides how it begins to unpack. We further also identify that shifting the power could advance social justice where there's none. It can foster reconciliation. It can also promote human rights and healing, amplify inclusive and diverse voices, and also advance memorialization processes, but also grant access to basic services. And in the context of the analysis that we conducted with the 6 sites that we're working with, on the work that they've done in conducting an analysis study, we identify these as desired outcomes or what we aspire to achieve. So social justice, foster reconciliation, promoting human rights, healing for communities we're working with, emerged as strong points that the sites are wanting to achieve as outcomes. Amplifying inclusive and diverse voices, it cut across. Memorialization was one of the strong outputs that were identified. And I think there's one site that was focused on the promotion of access to healthcare. And this is in the context of COVID-19 and the exclusion that's being seen in Taiwan, if I may mention, of having migrants not having access to basic services and healthcare. Can I have the next slide, please? We then undertook an exercise to further zoom into various sources of where the power lies. The first box speaks about conscious capabilities, which begins to look at the self. In this, we undertaken a process where we scope in program leaders or participants, or those that are leading projects in the museum. What is your level of consciousness in terms of if you're working with a community of girls or women? Do you understand the issues? Are you equipped? Are you conscious enough on race issues? Are you aware about policies that begin to deal with gender-based violence? Do you have access to networks that can support the work that you do? The next one looks at resources, and it speaks about access to those resources, whether it be tools such as recording tools to document voice, financial resources, access to safe spaces where you can host young girls, young women that have experienced gender-based violence. Are those spaces safe? Are they accessible to communities that you're working with? So that's at an individual level as you assess yourself as a museum or a site. At a more formal level, we looked at norms and exclusionary practices. These are outside your scope. Are you operating the museum within a context that perpetuates issues such as xenophobia? For an example, is gender-based violence even recognized as a crime in your country? Are policies in place that are dealing with that? If you look at the formal rules and policies, it then begins to speak about those. Do they speak to economic conditions of migrants? Do they speak to political stability, economic climate, access to healthcare facilities? So those are the 4 quadrants that we classified as where the power lies, where we need to begin to look in the context of correcting the records. Can I have the next slide, please? We then borrowed this matrix from Just Associate, which speaks about a form of how power moves in a continuum and its mechanisms, examples, and how communities and institutions such as sites can begin to address those challenges. The first one is the visible, making and enforcing rules. This speaks to how policies and legislation is implemented. Instruments such as policies, laws, constitutions, are they friendly to issues, or do they even speak to issues that we'd like to see change in? The second box you see speaks about the hidden, which is setting the agenda, exclusion and delegitimization of the laws. Examples here would be around industries being controlled, and you see this largely in the environmental space, policies and public debate about global warming. Are issues being made elite? Do they trickle down to communities? Are they visible? Do we speak about them? The last one is on invisible and shaping meaning, value, and what's normal. So this is around issues of socialization and control of information, cultural norms, the values, the practices, ideologies, but also the customs that shape people's understanding of their needs and rights and roles. I'll jump the middle one. It speaks largely about examples, but move to the last column, right at the top. Some of the strategies to correct these could be around lobbying and monitoring, negotiating and litigation, public education, developing shadow reports, marches and demonstration, voting and running for office, modeling innovations and collaboration. Under hidden setting the agenda, some of the strategies could be organizing communities and active constituencies, strengthening your organization and coalitions, participatory research, but also using alternative media outlets to amplify voices of communities you're working with. On shaping meaning, values, and what's normal, you could begin work around popular education, empowerment, and creating new knowledge. And I think the work that we're doing sits squarely on this because it's within our control. And I'd like to ask for the next slide where we zoom into the last row. Can you move into the next slide before we come to this? Okay, the next one, I see it might have been removed. Can I have the next slide? This one, thank you. In analyzing the first process, which was to answer questions about who's your audience, who are you wanting to work with in communities to respond to correcting the record. The 6 sites identified their primary communities. And we felt that this is the space where communities that were identified would sit. For one reason, that this is within our control, shaping meaning, values, and what's normal. Largely because the outcome that we'd like to see is to have an inclusive approach to documenting voice, to correcting what the archives contain at the moment, but to also give power to those that we are working with through amplifying their voices and also granting them access to resources that they would need. If you move to the last quadrant around strategies, we began zooming into some of the things that we would need to do to ensure that participation of these communities is at least guaranteed. And one of the tactics that we had identified was to start by creating a safe base for participation. The analysis indicates that in some of the sites, primary communities don't have access to the physical space, whether it's because of if you work with migrants, they don't have space due to opening or closing hours of the site. The site is in a zone where they have to commute, and by the time they get to the space, the site is closed. In the case of, I think it's Brazil, there were issues around language and how to begin to build confidence in your primary communities, bridge the language gap. So those are the issues we need to look at. How do we connect with communities such as young girls in Uganda? When we work with communities, we can't get a direct access to them without going through their parents. Will they be able to speak and have their stories heard in the presence of adults? So those are the dynamics that we thought this column begins to look at and unpack the issues that we're working with, but also empower us to do the work that we need to do. Can I have the previous slide to this? The previous one. So these are some of the issues that we identify as exclusionary practices that museums or sites have identified. And the first one is around immigrants needing to understand the museum as a safe and welcoming place for their questions and cultural manifestations. So here we need to create safe spaces that are political space. And when we say political, that are conscious of the issues that we work with, that are conscious of the legislation and policies that silences immigrants. The second issue that I have already touched on is around girls below the age of consent as direct beneficiaries or your primary community are engaged through caregivers for decision-making, which in most cases robs them of direct engagement. So their voices are mediated. They don't get an opportunity to tell their stories or to express what they go through directly. And that takes away their power of voice. Immigrants with no understanding of a language are excluded from participating or engaging. I think this is also in the case, we saw that in the case of Taiwan, where immigrants are not communicated with in the language that they understand, and they are disempowered. Lack of inclusive engagement with primary beneficiaries, policies and structural limitation to participation of primary community, economic, educational, political, religion, and cultural. And here it's also linked to the case of Taiwan, where government communicates in a language that immigrants do not understand. And the question around this would be, how do we then facilitate that process within our space? Because that's where the power lies, and we ensure that immigrants are not excluded. Primary communities are not engaged entirely in decision-making because of the vulnerability levels, for example, literacy levels, ignorance, emergency situation, language, and race. The last one is lack of resources to comprehensively support the process of representation. And this one was also a permitting, it was an emerging throughout the sites. And I think it's one that has the potential to close out the primary communities from participating. Can I have the next slide, please? Then we identify various forms of power that we needed to look into. The power in resources. Some of the sites had already begun looking at the resources that they would need to begin correcting the record. For instance, there's a site that had a thinking around documenting voices. However, legislation in the country, I think it's Taiwan, would crack down on them. How, as a site, do you ensure that your primary community is safe, but also utilize resources within the network to ensure that you begin to document voices and ensure that you amplify those. So in this space, the analysis pointed to power in collaborating. How do you tap into resources that are outside your space, but within the network? The power in structures, I think we've spoken about this in terms of the governance, but also family structures where young girls cannot, we can't gain access to them because we need to go through parents, through, are you having to work through chiefs, through community leaders? How do you ensure that you get buy-in so that you get direct access to your beneficiaries? The power in identity and relationships. It again speaks to the case of working with vulnerable communities, but also in countries where we work with the LGBTI. Do they come out and identify as such? And how do we begin to speak in the language that they talk in and ensure that we understand and create safe spaces for them? The power in framing. Are we not taking away in the way we're framing? Are we framing in the negative or in a way that amplifies the issues that we talk about? So I think that's very important to look into, because there's power in how you frame your narratives. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, we've done this one. We again borrowed this model because in the space that we work in, we identified that building a knowledge base is very important, but combined with that, we needed to ensure that there's amplifying of the work that we do to achieve indirectly political and policy change, because that's the indirect consequence that we will have. Underneath knowledge, we recognize that we needed to create spaces of reflection on experience and also support it with popular education, facilitate new ideas, but also research, analysis of power within context that we work in. Under the noise, we also recognize engaged constituencies, effective community leaders, alternatives, hopeful inspiration, organization and facts, alliance and movements. That's very important. Strategies and tactics that will ensure that we amplify the work that we do. But underpinning all of this, we recognize that we needed to analyze where power lies in form of positions, arguments and demands, because everyone that enters the space have different expectations. Alternatives, whether it's in resources such as the medium or channels we're using, messages, media and public education, popular education processes. Can I have the next slide, please? In shifting power for transformational narratives, we identify contextual power analysis. Space for sense of self-worth is very important, I think, this one, to create that base for community engagement. Building collective leadership locally to ensure that all the work is rooted in communities. Collective well-being and safety prioritize. Memory, popular education, and raising awareness. The next one was around partnerships and networks. We need to create capacity to think and act beyond our boundaries, but also be autonomous and have the ability to overcome competitiveness, to work together, respect for inclusion and diversity with clarity, defined vision. We must be clear in what we do. And the outcome for this is that our narratives, records, or whatever we're doing is impactful, whether on policy change, we advance social justice, we build inclusive memories that will be transformative, whether we use them for reconciliation, education around racism, gender equality, or we restore dignity and foster healing. Can I have the next slide, please? The last one is just about points that we needed to touch on as we build from the ground up. We need to analyze and develop concepts that are necessary ingredients for effective change, but also examine all forms of power. We can't just be satisfied with examining power within our organizations. It's very important to also look at your region, your country, because that has an impact on the work that you do and the voices that you begin amplifying and putting out there. Most groups do not have the full range of resources. It's important to tap
La mayoría de grupos no tienen el alcance total, y ver cómo es que uno empieza a hacer el trabajo que uno necesita hacer, el cambio efectivo, las estrategias requieren un nivel de organización. Esto también se ve a través de organizaciones. Taiwán trabaja con organizaciones que apoyan a los inmigrantes, así que hay colaboración, hay una aproximación colaborativa. La desigualdad no es resuelta por regiones, así que queremos estar trabajando sin tener que construir tantos archivos, sin tratar con la problemática, asegurando de que uno deje a las comunidades empoderadas y no solo ir quitándoles y priorizando procesos. Así que en un sentido es como pensando de manera humanitaria. La información es vital para el trabajo, pero no motivará a las personas a actuar. Usted habrá notado que en la apertura Yeye, yo me referí a Martin Luther King por inspiración. A veces tenemos que hacer eso, pero no quitando al trabajo mensajes persuasivos y valientes. Esto va a captar la atención del público en cuanto a cómo brindar soporte para nuevas alternativas, pero el mundo no se puede enmarcar bajo eslogans para poder reenergizar y asegurarnos de que en la medida que vayamos entrando ese poder.
And I believe this is the end of my presentation, and I end with this picture, which was taken during the Fees Must Fall movement, which then became a global supported movement. It gained synchronicity. In the center of the picture, you see a vice chancellor of a university, Wits University, sitting with students. What it demonstrates is that to work with a community, you bring yourself to their level and understand their issues, not talk down to them or over them, but walk the path with them. And thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Lebo, and thank you for keeping the time. It was such an important insight and presentation, and a very comprehensive overview of all aspects we need to look into to shift power within organization. And it was also very important to hear very practical example and practices that you identified together with the sites of conscience that are currently piloting the correcting the recall methodology. So thank you very much. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Radhika GIJTR. I'm sorry, Radhika. So Radhika is a researcher, curator, and development practitioner working on oral history and memory, socioeconomic stability, conflict transformation, and peace building work. She's based in Sri Lanka, and she has over 16 years of experience. Designed by her and implemented together with Vilutu Center, the Her Story Archive is a collection of autoethnographic oral histories of war-affected women from Sri Lanka. As a collection of gendered narratives of war, peace, and justice, it is archived at the National Archives of Sri Lanka as its first women oral history collection. She conceptualized and, together with Search for Common Ground, implemented the Community Memorialization Project, which has not only collected and archived ordinary people's life experience of conflict, but used the stories for people-to-people exchanges who facilitated dialogue for non-recurrence of violent conflict. The online collection is at www.memorymap.lk. And she read English and communication theory at York University, Toronto, Canada, and holds a master's in development management from the London School of Economics and Political Science in London. As one of our two correcting the record mentors, Radhika will bring a deep knowledge of community memorialization to guide us on essential ethical approaches to story collection and safeguarding when working with communities. So Radhika, the floor is yours, and also, again, in the interest of keeping time, we will communicate with you via chat box to let you know how your presentation timing is going. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Justine. Thank you very much for that introduction. I have been asked to speak on the ethical dimensions of oral history documentation today. And as she was talking about where this experience comes from, is from doing some community memory and oral history work in Sri Lanka. So I will give you a very brief introduction to the projects and to the idea of where all of these experiences that I'm going to speak about right now comes from. As you may know, Sri Lanka experienced a 26-year war beginning in 1983, ending in 2009, between the government and the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. It ended in a military victory that consequently framed the way history was constructed post-war, whose history was prioritized and whose was excluded. And the government at the time chose a nation-building narrative that was excluding or marginalizing some people. Particularly, this meant that for women's voices, that they were left out of the narrative of history unless they were portrayed as victims or as mothers and wives, usually of the government soldiers who fought in the war. So essentially, their grief was used in part of the nation-building narrative, representing the grief of a nation. So the feminizing of war narratives in Sri Lanka became all the more important to bring in the women's point of view, not from a man's perspective, but from the women's perspective herself. So the Her Stories project that you see a visual of there is an archival project that began 3 years after the end of the war. And it is one of the first of its kind. It collected 285 narratives of women from all over the country. Next slide, please. The Community Memorialization project, it goes beyond collecting and archiving narratives to working with the stories through a series of dialogues on peace building. 352 stories were collected in 3 districts of the country, and the project centered around creating space for acceptance of multiple narratives as a catalyst for dialogue. This begs the question, why is documenting women's histories with such a specific and structured focus necessary from a historical or memorialization point of view, perhaps even from a legal perspective? Next slide, please. Partially, it's because we live in an essentially patriarchal socioeconomic and cultural space, which will influence what is remembered and how. Therefore, choosing specific methodologies that we will probably go into in the next 3 or 4 hours is about finding ways in which these dominant paradigms of how history is created, how truth is documented, are changed in a way that is specific to women's stories. Dominant narratives may also legitimize a single truth. The ability to be heard or the inability to be heard may ignite root causes of conflict and continue to entrench historic marginalizations of women and ethno-religious communities and traditional gender roles. Whatever the context, dominant narratives may embody binaries of us and them, victor and vanquished, victim and perpetrator. But history is also made up of emotional responses. And for this, perspective matters. And counter memories that go beyond aggregates of figures are important to add such perspective. Next slide, please. Organic and grassroots processes of community memorialization is vital to the process of ensuring multiple narratives. But the past is remembered always from the present. So memories may change, they may change shape, they may be filtered through current socioeconomic conditions and current fears and current security concerns. This makes eyewitness accounts particularly insecure. When I say eyewitness accounts, I mean even what you see from different vantage points, but also your own personal experience of what you've experienced. This may be of violence, this may be of certain incidents during war, it may be even positive memories. But with passing time, these may change, and that necessitates documentation as early as possible and in situ, whatever the context may be. Formal justice mechanisms may also shape the truth-telling process itself. If you're in a commission of inquiry that is asking you about the disappeared, your responses will be kind of limited to that question of the disappeared. From a women's history point of view, there is so much more that goes beyond that particular moment in time. And the labeling of women as victims, for example, or mothers of the disappeared, or many other different labels that are used in the process of justice or truth collection mechanisms may actually affect the way that memory is recorded. And of course, it will affect the way the self-esteem of women, because if it's only recorded in the context of victimhood, and that victimhood is sometimes manipulated and used in greater narratives, particularly of greater narratives that strengthen power dynamics of a particular context, then that narrative will continue to subjugate and destroy the self-esteem of women. So there is, in these contexts, in the way these are recorded, there are symbolic and deliberate silences that life history formats that we will probably go into in the next presentation will produce, will counter, and it will help in producing these counter narratives, the kind of correcting the record that we're talking about today. Next slide, please. So some of the features of projects that what I'm going to speak about in terms of the ethical dimensions come from some of the key common features of these projects that also actually support the process of understanding how to be more ethical, are that they are point of view driven, they're qualitative, they're intensely personal, reflective, and open-ended, recognizing that truth is subjective and not absolute. They're always, most often, done in safe spaces. They can be done individually or in groups, but in spaces where individuals will feel that the power dynamics that are inherent within the community can be mitigated. And this is very important in the context of women's histories, because for women particularly, the way they see, the way they speak is contextualized by who is listening, by who is around, and by cultural norms. The projects are based on mutual respect and collaboration between the narrator and the documenter. And there is always an empathetic, active listening role that is essential rather than a one-dimensional interview, because that, again, there is a power dynamic there. So this kind of process needs to always be built on collaboration. Verbal and non-verbal life history formats were used rather than the traditional question and answer formats. And they're almost always autoethnographic, meaning that the narrator determines and controls his or her own story, and that gives you the space for self-censorship. And the ownership of the story is always with the storyteller. The next slide, please. Sorry, can you go back 2 slides up, please? No, that's fine. Sorry. Go back down to the next one. So the methodologies, the next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. The methodologies that were chosen from a verbal and non-verbal point of view focus on expression. So you will see a multiplicity of different types of methodologies that were used. Letter writing, which is done in private in their own time, is something that is very usable in the context of recording women's stories, because you can write it in your own space, in your own time. It gives the woman an addressable other, but it keeps her away from the male gaze. And then trees of life that you see below on the left, that's another process that helps a woman narrate her own story. But because she writes the entire story and then is able to see her story on a piece of paper, there is also a process of self-esteem building in that kind of context. So some of these formats are unmediated, presented as they are, and self-written. Some of these, such as the photo essays or the audio interviews or the video interviews, are more mediated by question and answer, and therefore the better formats really are the ones where they're written by the person themselves, because, as I said, it allows for self-censorship and it allows for greater control. In most of these, anonymity was a concern, and except for where people were willing to show their faces or wanted to show their faces, anonymity was something that is easy to maintain through visual formats such as the trees of life and so on. The next slide, please. So this brings us to the ethical challenges that emerged, particularly in working in gendered spaces. While we can and should delve deeper into these and understand what impact they may have on the specific, that they may have on the specifics of our own contexts, I think I will leave that for you to determine and think about. But what I will provide for you here are some of the lessons and some of the challenges that I faced and my team faced when we were doing the projects that I just talked about earlier. So one of the things, ethical challenges that came about was causing unintentional and unexpected harm. And some of these are basically psychological trauma. So in discussing traumatic experiences, whether it's violence or rape or disappearances or experiences of war, the private experiences that a person may feel, that the emotions that are attached to those experiences can be very traumatic. So revisiting the past may prove deeply emotional or distressing for the participants. So researchers' experiences of listening to these stories may also be painful. And the publication, the reinterpretation and dissemination of participants' stories may also be upsetting for the participants themselves to see, and if they're misinterpreted because their words are changed or edited, then that can also be very harmful and cause psychological trauma. To address these issues, oral historians should consider what resources are available from the area in terms of social workers, counselors, and psychologists to accompany the process. Stigmatization is another concern. This can happen within the community, sometimes because it may be seen as a breach of decorum to talk about one's personal experiences or feelings. It could be a breach of confidentiality if a person's anonymity is breached and they're identifiable through their characteristics or our inadequate attention to the way they are represented or presented, perhaps through an exhibition. And it may increase the vulnerability of that person in terms of how their privacy is breached. I'll give you a small example from one of my projects. I revisited some of the women who were sharing their stories 10 years after collecting their stories. And one of the girls that I revisited, she was reticent when I asked the question whether there were any consequences in her telling the story. But eventually she told me that her brother had burnt her hand because she had shared a story. Even though it was an anonymous story, her brother had still burnt her hand for sharing the story. So we may not even know that there are some cases in which post-event that might affect. So it's very important to actually be cognizant of and ask if they're fully aware of what sharing the story might mean for them in their own context. Physical and perceived security of the interviewer in their community and vulnerability to conflict is another factor that might cause unintentional harm. So one of the things that might help in that context is to secretly observe the behavior of the participant while they're talking to us. Hand gestures, the way they look around might indicate to us that there are non-verbal signs that they're not feeling safe. And it is up to us to immediately remove the person from the space or to ask if they want to stop what they're doing. Failing to respect cultural traditions and values of the interviewers would be another aspect that would cause unintentional harm. So respecting the cultural norms, if a face needs to be covered or you're not supposed to touch someone's hand, something like that, just respecting and understanding those cultural norms and bringing that into a process is important. Next slide, please. One of the other ethical concerns is trying to understand that there are always contesting narratives. As we said previously, there are always many truths, particularly with a personal narrative, but if about an event or how a person remembers these events much later in the process. And when contesting narratives are emerging from the same community, it's important to not question that, because they may not be absolute truths, but subjective truths, and just allow for those contesting narratives to coexist. It is important to let this happen and not influence what you think you might know or what you think you might have heard before, and challenge the next, the contesting narrative that's emerging. One of the things that you have to be, I think, cognizant of in this process is credibility and the reliability of accounts. There is always false memories in the context of collecting these entrenched stories. There are time lapses, and the eyewitness accounts may fade with memory or change in the way they remember. And there are the ethical or the cultural, the ethnic, cultural, or religious or tribal dimensions of how a story is told may actually influence the way the truth is shared. And sometimes, in certain situations, the way the story is shared will also be depending on the victim, perpetrator, survivor narratives. And sometimes these are nuanced. For example, in the context of ex-combatants, they may also be victims, but they may also be perpetrators at the same time. So allowing for the fluidity of what that story might mean and how the story is told is a concern, an ethical concern that we need to be careful about. And in this process, what's important to remember is not to cause further harm, and to be aware of recognizing contesting narratives and allowing them to coexist in a space. One of the things that helps in terms of managing these ethical dimensions of contrasting narratives is to potentially have follow-up conversations, follow-up dialogue with the community, with highly trained and skilled facilitators. But this allows for a sense of triangulation of data. And when a collection is created with individual stories, even if there are victim, perpetrator, survivor dynamics within that, there may be the triangulation of stories will actually provide certain types of corroborations for the stories, where a sort of a trend of truth will emerge from even the contesting narratives. The next slide, please. One of the other ethical dimensions to be aware of are the gender dynamics. And especially when we're recording women's stories, women's histories, it's important to remember that gendered roles and gendered identities are built out of ethnicity, race, the community, the tribe, the religion that where one's identity is interpolated. In some communities, women may be subordinate to their husbands or the males in their family, which might mean that men are required to be present for all interviews. This is not great, but there's always ways in which one's to move around it, and I'll speak a little bit about this. This kind of male presence and the male gaze will color the interview. It may lower the chances of testimonies, particularly in individual testimonies related to violence, from coming out. Sometimes community narratives may have to be sanctioned by their men, particularly elders from the community after the fact. It is also possible that the women are expected to remain quiet and allow for men to answer the questions on behalf of them. And this is a very particular ethical challenge when it comes to recording women's histories and women's stories. And sometimes while a researcher needs to respect that kind of community's cultural practices, there are other ways in which we can approach women. And here's where it's really important to seek out women leaders and trusted supporters of the community who work with these women and women leaders. This is where visiting and revisiting women over a period of time to build deeper relationships matters. It is, and at one point there will be an opportunity to speak to the women alone. And this is where over time, the same conversation can happen, the same narrative can be revisited and embellished and built into a more truthful narrative. But it's also important to be cognizant of the potential risks to the women and any sort of self-esteem diminishing factors that might crystallize their sense of victimhood. The next slide, please. I will run through this quickly. And one of the things that is very important to remember here is that it's the one above, actually. Slide before, yeah. Yes, so it's generally inappropriate to offer tangible benefits in the context, particularly in the context of post-disasters and conflict that might influence the story, that might actually make it a transactional process of collecting oral history narratives. This affects the integrity of the methodological process of collecting narratives as well. And this is where it's almost always useful to make it a voluntary process and to make it a collaborative exercise. And this kind of financial benefit or a project benefit also has some kind of coercive power that we need to be careful about. So no promises should be made. It should not be a motivating factor for people to participate in the process of collecting stories. And it's always important for us as individuals that are working in the process of collecting stories to recognize who holds the power in every situation. And I know Lebo explained this a little bit more, but the idea and understanding of who holds the power, which might in some cases be us, is something that we need to be very careful and understand. Next slide, please. Choosing a narrator in some cases might create a selection bias. And sometimes a pre-interview is not possible to do. And a process of series of interviews or series of collections is also not possible to do. But we have to be careful about the extractive possibilities of going in, collecting a story and coming out and never revisiting that community again. So it's unethical to choose stories and unethical to choose individuals based on their relevance or their unique experiences if we have not provided the space for the community itself to understand who should tell their stories or what stories should or what focus should be presented there. The space and the right of the interviewers to say what and how they feel or what they want to say, but also to forget and avoid what they don't want to talk about is important. There is a danger in stereotyping and misrepresenting and manipulating the narrator's words if we as interviewers choose the stories. There's also a danger of asking leading questions, and this is where interviewer intrusion comes in. So it's usually useful in this context to prepare, to ask informed questions, to have a collaborative approach, and to achieve a balance between achieving our objectives and the project objectives and the perspectives of why a person, a narrator, wants to share their story and what goals and purposes they have in sharing their stories. The next slide, please. The other thing to be cognizant of is in terms of language, dialects and translation. And here we have to be careful about the nuances of languages, especially if you're using a different language and interpreters. There are several questions to think about here. If you have translated from one language to another, which language constitutes the direct quotes? Which language, how do you understand the signifiers and the nuances of the original language? If you're transcribing from one language to another, it's useful to have a tape with their permission so that you are able to transcribe it verbatim. Do you speak, like, for example, understanding the cultural nuances, the hand gestures, the visual clues, and the visual cues of how a person tells a story is important as well. And this is usually very important in the process of writing something down, because the emotion and the feeling attached to words may not be very clear. So again, it's useful to tape the conversations if permission is given to do so. Next slide, please. So how do we mitigate some of these ethical concerns that that emerge from in the process of documenting? So I've come up with some, there's many, but these are 8 essential ethical considerations that you might find useful. One is confidentiality. Again, we touched on this a little bit about the impact of breaching confidentiality, but it is absolutely important that informed consent is received and confidentiality and anonymity is maintained if that is what is required. In terms of informed consent, it is very important to consider to understand that the person understands what you are saying. So language is useful here and important here. And if children are involved, then a legal guardian or a parent needs to be there always. It's important that a risk assessment is done of the context. Consider all potential risks to the interviewer and the interviewee. For example, if there are security risks, if there are risks from a cultural perspective or a religious perspective, these are all important to understand from a risk assessment point of view. Again, as we spoke before, no promises or reciprocity should be offered. It should always be voluntary and collaborative process. There should be special consideration when it comes to minors. And it comes with a whole other host of ethical issues that we haven't gotten into today. But we need to be careful when it comes, we can talk about it and think about how girl minors need to be protected and their self-esteem managed in a process of documentation. It's also important to think about not to approach the subject with preconceived assumptions about what they might say or who they might be, but to let the interview and the process of collecting the documentation flow. It's very important that we are, through this context analysis, that we are very cognizant of the vulnerability of others, not strengthening power dynamics and not strengthening the power of gatekeepers. It's important to cooperate with these people, but not facilitate power structures. And in this context, we need to think about, try to break down without necessary, and it's also important to think that it's also that we shouldn't try to break down power structures without the necessary support systems to address the whole system. So I think Lebo spoke a little bit about understanding power, shifting power, and being conscious of the cultural norms that determine how power is constructed and understood. And this is something we need to think about when we're understanding the context and doing a risk assessment as well. I will quickly, next slide and the last slide, I will quickly run through the responsibilities of an interviewee in this process. One is that it is important that all of the procedures that you're thinking about in the process of documenting is written down and understood from a methodological point of view. If possible, it is important to include and try and get the interviewees to think about this process as well and have their feedback feature within this methodological process. It is important for the interviewer to be aware of their own safety and no interview or no documentation is as important as the person's safety, your safety, and the narrator's safety. And therefore, again, an interviewer is responsible for doing a context analysis and a risk assessment of the situation at all times. It is important to clearly indicate where these narratives, collected narratives, where they will be, what they will be used for, and how they will be used. And if confidentiality will ever be a concern, it is important to let people know that they can always withdraw their narratives from the collection. And this is something that is very important, that will safeguard the person. In the case where gender-based violence issues are prevalent, it is important to seek out women leaders or trusted support of the community, as well as make sure that referral systems that support safety and security are factored in and built within your program. And some of these ethical challenges, as we were talking about, is possible to mitigate, and some of them are beyond our control. But what I think from this experience that I've shared with you, what I would like you to do is to think about if any of these resonated with you in your contexts, and develop your own methodology that accommodates some of these ethical challenges. One thing to remember as we leave is that context matters, it always matters. And leaving communities empowered and as collaborators rather than an extractive exercise of collecting oral histories is absolutely important. Do not hesitate to contact me if you need any further clarifications. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Radhika. And thank you so much for this great presentation and sharing the ethical challenges that emerge when collecting stories, and also sharing the experience you had with the Her Story project. There is a question in the chat, so I think we can take a few minutes to address the question of Thiago. So Radhika is asking you if you think, is it important to use a sense of unicity or coherence between the stories we collect to make the change Lebo talk about? So he's referring to elements the testimony would have in common as the questionnaire in which the interaction will be based. You can see his question in the chat.
Sorry, I was muted. Yes, I mean, it depends on the purposes of oral history documentation. In the context of understanding that some of these, the content may not necessarily be absolute truths, but vantage points, it's important to understand that you can build a certain sense of coherence with the triangulated data and have a few key outputs that come out of the stories that you can use in shifting power dynamics. But involving the people within that process and asking them how their stories can be used in the pursuit of other agendas is also important, because then it doesn't become extractive, which is an ethical challenge that comes up in the usage of oral histories. But yes, it can definitely be used to dismantle power structures. But as I said before as well, the whole system needs to be thought about when you're doing that kind of using of oral histories to dismantle power structures. It can't, without the necessary support structures to do that, you can end up causing more harm. So we've got to be careful and think about the entire context and what capabilities and structural elements you may have in possession to be able to do that. But a certain coherence within the stories will emerge as you collect and develop a collection.
Thank you, Radhika. There is another question from George. He's asking, when interviewing someone, what do you do to ensure that the interviewee receive help should they re-experience trauma as a result of the interview?
One of the things that's absolutely important is not to approach people who not to force people to tell their stories. It is not our right to ask people to tell their stories. And it is also sort of important to think about us in this context as someone who walks along rather than someone who walks in front of someone. So if you think about it from a visual perspective like that, sort of someone who walks along someone, then you will think about it from the context of what they might need. So first of all, before beginning a project, it's absolutely necessary that any referral systems and any processes that support psychological and psychosocial development is factored into your project. So you need to build that kind of referral system before you approach communities. And the second thing is that you need to be able to understand visual cues. As I said in my presentation as well, these are non-verbal cues that everybody will be able to, everybody emits, and we all do that. And if you find that these visual cues are sort of re-traumatizing the person, if you know they're emotionally distressed, then it's your responsibility to ask the person if they would like to stop the interview, ask them if they need help, and refer and direct them to that support structure. The other thing to factor in is beyond the emotional the cues is that the re-traumatizing may not happen as you see it immediately. It might happen 5 days, 10 days, 1 year after telling their story. So it's absolutely important that they have a way to contact you or to contact an elder that led you to that process, or contact an organization that they are familiar with, so that they are able to say, something's wrong, I need your help. So just to be clear, 3 things: the context analysis, approaching communities or individuals through elders or known people, being aware of visual cues, and having a referral system and a structured psychosocial support system developed in advance would help.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Radhika. I just want to mention that at the end of the workshop, we will have a 40 minutes session for question and answer. So you could also ask your question to Lebo and Radhika. So now we will have a 10 minutes break. So I think we should come back at 35 minutes past the hour. Thank you very much, and see you in 10 minutes.
Goes 80 minutes.
Time for us to introduce our next session. So thank you for rejoining us. And it is my pleasure to introduce you to Ana Moyo Copeta, who will guide us in our training session on empowering, sensitive, and non-re-traumatizing approaches to story collection. She is a human rights lawyer with 14 years experience working in legal and human rights fields, with a specific focus on legal research, gender, regional litigation, policy making, policy and legislative review and analysis, and development of continental policies and soft law instruments, including studies, guidelines, and general comments. Anna is currently the advocacy program manager at the Center for Study of Violence and Reconciliation in South Africa, where she is leading the organization's advocacy work at the national, regional, and international levels. She has a vision of an Africa that protects and promotes the rights of its citizens, especially women, in all their diversity, and restores the dignity and worth of victims of conflict and gross human rights violations, a continent committed to peace, to the peace, development, and well-being of its people. Anna, welcome. We're so thrilled to have you, and we look forward to your session. I understand that you'll project your own presentation, so we will stop sharing now and you can share your screen. So also, in the interest of time, I'll communicate with you via chat box just to let you know how your timing is going. We'll be together for the next 2 hours. Thank you. Apologies. Sorry, I believe. Everybody's back. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. I see my microphone is muted, so I apologize. And I was saying that after these amazing 2 presentations that we had by Lebo and Radhika with so much important information, it's my pleasure to introduce Ana Moya Cupeta, who will guide us on our training session on empowering, sensitive, and non-re-traumatizing approaches to story collection. She's a human rights lawyer with 14 years experience working in the legal and human rights fields with a specific focus on legal research, gender, regional litigation, policymaking, policy and legislative review and analysis, and the development of continental policies and soft law instruments, including studies, guidelines, and general comments. Ana is currently the Advocacy Program Manager at the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation in South Africa, where she is leading the organization's advocacy work at the national, regional, and international levels. She has a vision of an Africa that protects and promotes the rights of its citizens, women especially, in all their diversity, and restores the dignity and worth of victims of conflict and gross human rights violations. A continent committed to the peace, development, and well-being of its people. So welcome, Ana. We look forward to your session. We are excited to have you here. I also understand that you project your presentation, so you please go ahead and share your screen now. And in the interest of time, I'll be communicating with you also via chat box, just to let you know how your timing is going. The floor is yours. Apologies, but I don't understand why my microphone is getting.
You are good, JJ. You are good. We could hear you 2 times. You're good.
All right. Well, the 2 times, because it's like the microphone is muted.
It's all good.
Sorry.
It's all good.
Apologies.
For those who join later, take out the presentation. So thank you. Ana, it's all yours now. Thanks. I think Ana might be changing her location, so maybe we have to wait 30 seconds or so.
We'll resume in 2 minutes. We're just waiting for Ana to be able to change her space.
Meantime, I will share the Padlet for this session in the chat box, and you can find there materials, Ana's presentation, the agenda for today, and some questions we sent in advance to reflect on this upcoming session.
They really highlighted some of the issues that I'm also going to address and perhaps expand on in my session. So looking at collecting and centering community voices, I think, and thank you to the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience for really bringing this important aspect, the almost forgotten aspect of documentation processes and memorialization processes, when really at the center of some of these processes, victims should be included, and also sensitivity around some of their needs and some of what they present with, and just taking better care of victims through some of these processes, and including them, having them participate, and acknowledgement of what they bring to the table should really be of utmost importance. I will not waste any more time. I took about 5 minutes trying to find a spot, but perhaps I can start from here around what do we mean by centering victims on a practical note. Radhika spoke about different things, including ethical considerations, some of the sensitive ways, particularly when documenting the stories from women, where the gender sensitivity issues have to come to the fore. But I'll take this forward, looking particularly at some of the practical, some things to take note of on a practical perspective on what can be done and what do we mean, how can we actualize centering victims and collecting victims or communities' voices in a way that is not harmful to victims. So the do no harm principle is important, but also at the same time ensuring that victims are left right and center of some of these processes from the onset all the way to the end of some of these processes. So I'll be building upon what Radhika said earlier, and perhaps just bringing in some of the practicalities. Radhika spoke about the need, in summary, the need of the victim's version of events, of what happened to them, playing a key role in what is documented and in some of the processes. So what is this victim's version of events, or what happened to them, and why does it matter? Just borrowing from what Radhika said, it is the victim's voice, so the story belongs to the storytellers. Therefore, it matters that then the storyteller's voice, the storyteller's narrative, the storyteller's vision, and the storyteller's words are what informs what is documented and what is presented as some of what came from the ground. So as much as possible, the victim's version of events should be preserved during some of these processes if we are really to center victims and bring in their voice at the center of some of these processes. So what they tell you is what happened is important. And interestingly, and this plays a role even for the victim as well towards their healing. When they see what they said written down in paper, word for word, having been captured, this is validating to the victim and empowering as well. I think in some of the contexts where we work in, I'll give example of South Sudan, where together with the ICSC and other partners in the GIJTR, where we have worked documenting gross human rights violations for transitional justice processes, some of the victims on the onset of the project, as far back as 2015, 2016, some of the victims had this one fear that they will either be killed or will die without having told their story. So their story will die with them. So there is power. It's powerful to document some of these versions. And some of them, when they saw for the first time some of what was documented as their stories for purposes of validation, it mattered so much to them. They felt that what happened to them has been captured, so it's going to outlive some of them. It's been documented, it's been archived, so there is memory of what happened to me as Anna, not what happened to a community or some people in a particular geographic area. But my name, what happened to me as Anna, has been captured, and it has been archived. And when the right time comes, this can be pulled out, and then people can know then what happened to me. And through memorialization, my name can also be put up there on any memorial site as one of the people who suffered from this atrocity. So this is important for victims and brings in and has some healing components to the victim, who then reads what happened to them and sees it in the future or at a later stage coming out as they said it. I think this is validating for victims. But also practically, how do we actualize this? The victim's version of events in the language of the victim, as Radhika pointed earlier. So documenting the events in the language and words of the victim is also important. And building upon what Radhika said, sometimes summarizing or shortening a victim's story can result in missing the nuances that Radhika spoke about. And this is important because when a victim speaks about what happened to them, there are specific nuances. And from an investigator point of view, and from a documenter point of view, and from a victim point of view, something gets missed when we try to summarize, when we try to shorten and condense what happened to a victim, to try either make space and then try to document better, or even sometimes try to correct the English. I think those of us who are lawyers in the room, again, I'll use the example of South Sudan, where most of the investigators and documenters were lawyers when we began the process. So, you know, knowing the correct language and terminology of certain processes, you feel the temptation to correct and put the correct word as opposed to what the victim said. But sometimes this misses the nuances as well. Translation versus first language of the victim. Again, Radhika spoke about this. So it goes back to missing some of the nuances when, for instance, we try now to translate what the victim said and put it in English or in a language that is spoken more broadly within a setting, or that a language that other people can also access and understand what happened in. And in most instances, at least in Africa, this means English or French or any of the African Union languages. So some vernacular words have their meaning or intensity of the occurrence watered down when translated. So when you say something in your vernacular language, it has got this intensity, it has this power, it captures what happened and the intensity or the severity of what happened. But when we translate it, sometimes, you know, English will have perhaps one word for 5, 6 different things in vernacular. So there is that emphasis on the severity when something is said in vernacular, and also vice versa. Sometimes vernacular may not have the right words to express what happened. It may have one word for a number of things that can be better explained in English. So again, around the balance to understand when language, for instance, can be a barrier to capturing the nuances around what actually happened to the victim. Again, Radhika spoke about this in her presentation. I think, again, drawing from what Radhika said, what I can emphasize is that sometimes it's so powerful to include phrases and sentences in the language of the victim, and then have and complement this with the English translation as an explainer, or to explain for those who may not understand the vernacular. This is how you then preserve the nuances and the severity and intensity of what was said in vernacular, ensuring that even in the translation or interpretation, the nuances are not lost. The do no harm principles also very important beyond the ethical considerations that Radhika spoke about, where you put the victim or the person affected by violence at the center. This is where you go beyond just ensuring that you have their consent, that you, for instance, let them know that they can stop at any time during the interview, where, for instance, issues of confidentiality, what you'll do with the information, and explaining to them what this information will be used for. So going beyond some of these, and this do no harm principle will call for you, for instance, to also consider what possible potential harm that the victim might be subjected to as a result of them coming forward to speak about what happened to them. Is there a potential for them to be singled out? Is there potential for them, for instance, to face a backlash? Is there potential, for instance, for them to be victimized because they have come forward to speak? So beyond just the anonymity of a victim, is it possible that by simply putting out the story of what happened to them, this could easily make them identifiable by community members and therefore face a backlash? And as Radhika beautifully pointed out, sometimes when capturing women's stories, the issues again around what it means for a woman to come forward and speak. In a setting like the Gambia, for instance, some of the obstacles for women to come forward and speak about their experiences is just the issue of consent. Women will need consent from their husband or their male counterparts to come forward and speak about what happened to them. And before this consent is obtained, a woman cannot come forward. So the do no harm principle will require that you really have this broad objective on what, of all the eventualities that may put the victim in harm if they come forward and or if their story or their experience is documented. So just looking at all of those and finding better strategies of mitigating some of the harm that may befall the victim because they have come forward to speak. Again, the do no harm principle sometimes, I think interestingly, and this comes up in some of the questions that we will look at together after the presentation, so that we together co-imagine how a safe space, how centering victims look like in some of these processes that we are undertaking on the ground. So sometimes do no harm principle. Perhaps I can use an example of some of the work that we are doing here in South Africa. Our office is the safe space. We have trauma counseling rooms that we provide to victims, and it's safe. They have the privacy that they need within this room. But what it means for the victim to come, some of our victims are refugees and asylum seekers. What it means for a victim to come to our offices to access this safe space for counseling services means that refugees and asylum seekers, they have to take taxis or transport, public transport, to come to our offices. In a xenophobic country like South Africa, this sometimes means that they will be stopped by the police on their way to come. For someone who's already traumatized by what happened to them in their country of origin, now coming to get services in South Africa, the country hosting them as a refugee or asylum seeker, add onto that the additional stressor of corruption when it comes to them legalizing their stay and renewing their permits in South Africa. Sometimes the permits then lapse because Home Affairs would want money or want bribes for them to renew their permits. So for such a person to come to our offices, for such a victim to come to our offices, it means that they are coming to our offices at the risk, they are accessing the service that they so desperately need at the risk of them being arrested by the police and being sent to a detention facility where they can then be deported to their country of origin. It also means that then they are susceptible to being bribed, to being asked to pay bribes by the police on their way to our offices. Sometimes it means that the little money that they have to come to our offices and access rehabilitation services, trauma counseling services, they have to literally do the math to say, this money is enough for me to buy food for my family for a meal for today, or I can go and access rehabilitation services. So when these competing interests are pitted against each other, rehabilitation becomes sort of like a secondary priority to food and feeding the family. And sometimes when this is pitted against a victim needing to go and work so that they can provide for the family and earn a salary, then missing work for those few hours or for the whole day and coming to CSVR, again, rehabilitation becomes a distant activity on the to-do list for a victim. So do no harm then requires us as CSVR, an organization providing services to victims, to also look at some of all of these eventualities, look at all of these occurrences and some of these additional stressors that victims present with before they can come and access services, and taking particular steps to mitigate some of these. So some of the steps, practical steps that we take is providing victims with transport money to come to our offices to access the services, providing them as well, for those who are working, providing them as well with a letter to take to their employer, because we are providing a service and they're accessing our services for purposes of them becoming healed citizens, healed people in communities who are empowered and can function better in society and in community and even in their families. So we write letters to employers explaining the need for our clients to come for counseling services, and explaining as well how this will impact their performance in the workplace and also their functionality in society and family and so forth. And even writing to families as well around the need, but of course with consent from the victim, as Radhika also pointed out earlier. So it's going beyond just the ethical considerations, but bringing in some of the legalities, the socioeconomic conditions, and hindrances that may present themselves, and of course the security issues that victims may face before they can come and access some of the services that we provide. Now I'll touch on the role of psychosocial support, perhaps also answer one of the questions that were asked earlier in the chat box about what do you then do when someone is traumatized by them during a documentation process or during the interview process, and it becomes clear that they cannot continue. So when we talk about the role of psychosocial support and centering victims, an important point is that this process needs to happen before the documentation process, during the documentation process, and after the documentation process. And one of the key roles that need to be at the center of this process when we are centering victims' voices is psychosocial support, provision of psychosocial support, and accompanying some of these processes, documentation processes and memorialization with psychosocial support services and containment. And this can be done before, during, and after the process. And what are some of the things that we need to look at before the documentation process or before the interview process? So this is where, for instance, care has to be taken around preparing the victim about what to expect during the interview process or the documentation process. For example, what sharing their story will evoke, for instance, some of the traumatic experiences, and the fact that perhaps sharing the story of what happened or sharing the experience will re-traumatize them and bring back some of those memories that are sometimes locked up because the body and the mind is trying to protect the victim from reliving the trauma and having a number of traumatic experiences and their impact on the person of the victim. So this will mean reliving the trauma basically, and experiencing all over again the very day of the incident in court, so to speak. So this is the time when, for instance, you bring in a psychosocial practitioner to prepare the victim, or an expert to prepare the victim on what to expect, what might come up during the interview process, and beginning to share some practical ways of dealing with this reliving of trauma by the victim during the interview process. So some breathing exercises, taking some breaks, amongst other things, and many other techniques that our psychosocial practitioners and experts have come up with as ways of coping, as ways of also disrupting the traumatic experiences and presentations during an interview process. Also, importantly, before the interview process the pre-documentation session, it's important to ask the victim how they feel about doing the session. Are they ready for it? What will they need as enablers for them to go through this process, so that also what victims feel they need is also put at the center of this documentation or memorialization process. Also importantly, to also share some of the benefits to the victim of telling their story and sharing their experiences. So it becomes a balancing act where you find out how the victim feels about the process. Are they ready for it? And sometimes they are not ready, and it's okay to say, okay, if you are not ready, it's okay. You won't participate now. Perhaps we will look for another opportunity for you to come forward when you are ready. But also sharing the benefits of telling their story. Again, the example that I shared earlier around what some of the victims in the South Sudan documentation process were saying to us right in the beginning also becomes important, that in the event that there is a formal TJ process, then at least what happened to you has been documented, and also it can be used for various other purposes as well, for transitional justice, and perhaps sometimes even outside transitional justice. It can be archived, it can be for memory purposes, it can be for many other outcomes as well within the transitional justice agenda. So again, balancing, finding out whether the victim is ready or not, and also some of the benefits, so that the victim makes an informed decision on whether to participate or not. During the interview process or the documentation process, also very important, perhaps now answering the question that was asked: what happens when someone breaks down during the interview process and it's clear that they are suffering from re-traumatization, they have relived the trauma and are presenting with the many symptoms of someone who has just become re-traumatized. You can refer the victim for psychosocial support during the documentation process. This is important. Sometimes, documenters or investigators feel that I need to finish the interview and then I can refer at the end. You can stop the interview right then and let the victim know that we can continue when you are better, when you are ready for us to continue. And you can keep that that form open and make notes even on it to say the victim got re-traumatized, we were unable to continue, the victim had to undergo, I had to refer the victim for canceling the interview to be continued on another date. And you can continue on another date when the victim is in a better place mentally, emotionally, and psychologically to continue with the interview. So you can stop the interview at any time when it becomes clear that the victim cannot continue anymore. So this can be done. But also, most importantly, I think this is where taking care really matters. And this is where some of our focus as CSVR in some of the pre-mission debriefings, we have focused on the fact that sometimes it's not about the victim saying, I'm unable to continue with the interview. Or sometimes it's not when the victim starts crying. There are many other symptoms as well that show you that the victim is in distress, and perhaps it's not feasible, it's not advisable to continue with the interview. And so you can be watching some of these emotional cues that Radhika spoke about earlier all throughout the interview. This is part of centering victims' voices and victims' experiences during a documentation process. So watch out for some of the emotional cues, watch out for distress when a victim starts presenting with some symptoms that show you that this is a difficult issue or they don't want to go there. So sometimes when you ask a question and the victim keeps on evading answering that question, or the victim talks about something completely different than the question that you have asked, sometimes this is a marker, this is proof that perhaps answering that question may be too heavy for the victim. And you can ask at this point to say, do you need to speak to someone? And also, most importantly, during the interview, I think interestingly, sometimes an interview can take more than that session, because the victim, not that the victim is not ready to speak, but the victim needs that emotional rapport with the interviewer in order to deem the space safe to share some of the intimate details about what happened to them. So again, some of the things to take note of. I think sometimes, particularly, and Radhika spoke a bit about this, particularly for victims of sexual violence, it's difficult to just come out in the first encounter and say, I was raped. It's very rare for women to meet the interviewer for the first time and speak about this, because they've been violated in the worst way possible. So it's not something that they can talk about just in a first encounter, just like that, but also because of some of the backlash they may face in communities, in their own families, and so forth. Sometimes women may not have disclosed some of these experiences, even to their own husbands, to their own family members. So it will take time. So it's always important that even during the interview, you make it clear to the victim to say, we can reopen the interview. If you have more information to share, we can reopen the interview and add more details to it. So not closing the door to the interview after you finished interviewing the victim. Also importantly, after the interview, where a victim is showing that they are traumatized, it's important to refer the victim to a psychosocial professional for sustained support and services to deal with some of their own trauma and start a healing journey. So there is always something to do before, during, and after the documentation process, and psychosocial support plays a big role in all of these processes, before, during, and after the process.
Anna, I have a question on the chat box. Do you want to answer it now, or you rather go through a few slides and then get questions towards the end of this section?
We can answer the question now. It's fine, Chishu. Thank you.
Okay. So Daniel Manyazi from Kenya asks the following question. Currently, we're having an incest molestation case. The violator is the breadwinner. He's admitted to having committed the offense. Do no harm will mean that he pleads for clemency. How may we navigate here? Do juggle between reconciliation and justice?
Thank you for that question. That's a really difficult one. I mean, the lawyer in me, I always say lately that I'm a socialized lawyer. CSVR socialized me. The lawyer in me will say definitely justice is important. A crime has been committed here, but the do no harm principles, as my colleagues in our mental health and psychosocial support program would say, the do no harm principle will require that we do what the victim is comfortable with. We don't put the victim in more harm than they have already experienced. So we protect the victim and we get our cue on what to do next from the victim. You can advise the victim on what needs to be done. This is important, but we have to be guided by the victim. It may be that the victim may not be ready at the time, but we can advise them on the best course. But at the end, it is the decision of the victim that should guide us on what needs to happen. And within this case, and in this case particularly, where there is incest and the perpetrator is the breadwinner, the victim may be thinking about a number of socioeconomic challenges that this will present if the breadwinner is taken away. Basically, some of the challenges we face with a number of GBV cases that we experience where the perpetrator is the breadwinner, and removing the perpetrator through the criminal justice system will mean then for the woman that there is no longer a breadwinner, presenting now with socioeconomic challenges. Just putting the foot on the table becomes difficult. But I think this is where also we need to, in doing no harm, we need to also give the victim as much information as possible, highlighting that a crime has been committed. This is a crime. This is the recourse that is available to them, the legal steps that need to be taken. the challenges, difficulties around that process, literally bringing all the information that the victim needs to make an informed decision, bring it to the attention of the victim so that the decision that they make then is informed by reality, is informed also by what needs to happen, the legal aspects, but as well as just looking at some alternatives around the socioeconomic challenges that may come to the fore if the perpetrator is removed through criminal sanctions. So this is important. This is where now some bit of advocacy needs to come in to inform the victim about all the different scenarios and having the victim then make their informed decision on what needs to happen going forward. So do no harm principle requires that we don't take steps on behalf of the victim. But I'm also aware, I don't know whether Kenya has got the similar laws around gender-based violence that we now have through the amendments of some of our GBV laws, where anyone who gets to know about particularly sexual violence committed against a woman, be it someone that the victim talks to, that person has a duty to report. So reporting a crime is no longer just is no longer just what a victim needs to do, but someone else who hears about it, who experiences, who witnesses it, can also go and report, so that we try and reduce the numbers. But even within this setting, because of the particularly because of the protection and the privilege that is and confidentiality afforded to some of these processes, the documentation process, when we now consider, together with the do no harm principle, the ethical considerations of documentation, even those laws will not have as much power. They get limited here, and centering victims particularly will then require that the victim is at the center of some of the next steps that need to happen when such incidents come up during the interview process. I don't know if I'm answering you. I know I'm not giving a clear answer, but when we are looking at ethical considerations and do no harm, these are some of the challenges that we face. We want to help, but unfortunately we have to be guided by the victim.
I want just to compliment here, Anna, that Angelina Nandwa, who works with Daniel in Kenya, has posted subsequently the judgment was passed yesterday and the victim has been jailed for life. So the justice system has acted. So maybe considerations on how to deal with the impact of that would be what to look at.
Yeah. Definitely. Thank you, Gigi. And thank you, Daniel, for sharing that and asking that question. Okay, can I continue?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay.
I'll let you know if there are other questions that pop up here.
Perfect. Thank you, Gigi. So now coming to some of the steps in the before documentation, some of the practical steps before documentation. We've spoken about counseling with that, right? The pre-counseling debriefings and containment of victims, sharing with them what to expect. But there are many other things that can be done as well outside psychosocial support. So now we are looking at the broader spectrum of practicalities or practical steps when collecting and centering victims at various levels. So we'll start with the before the documentation process, some of the practical steps. So beyond pre-counseling, also there is a need, and Radhika spoke about this as well, the need to manage victims' expectations. What can be done, what cannot be done, what is uncertain, what the information will be used for, etc. So some of the ethical considerations come in here, but it's really important to manage victims' expectations. So sometimes, you know, we tend to overpromise and around what this process will deliver. So sometimes it's why it's advisable not to speak in definite terms, but just, you know, highlight that it's not certain. There's no certainty as to what the information will be used for, or how far it can go, or what can be done afterwards. I think one of the things that documentation does is that it raises victims' expectations. Victims then expect something to come out of that process after they have had the interview with you. For victims, it's what's next, because something has happened. Therefore, there has to be a follow-on, a follow-up process. So managing victims' expectations is important and an integral part of centering victims as well. In most instances, documentation cannot achieve everything. I will go back to the South Sudan case where the documentation process that we've been doing for the past 6 years in this project has been happening informally, led by civil society and community-based actors in the country. Although the formal TJ process had not been established at the time. So this was happening informally it was not clear whether this documentation will fit into the formal TJ process. Now that the Commission for Truth, Healing and Reconciliation is established, again, it is not a given that what has been documented through informal processes will automatically make way into the mainstream of the collective narrative of what will be documented as well through this commission. So it's important to manage those expectations. And again, I think usually we see this push in practice where victims want to know, now that my story is known, now that I've identified the perpetrator, does this mean that the perpetrator is now going to be arrested? Again, something that we need to manage to say, not necessarily, it's not yet clear if it's uncertain what the information will be used for, but for us, these are the concrete steps that we are going to take. This information we've taken will be archived. This information that we've collected, we will do our best through advocacy to raise awareness about what's happening, but of course, protecting you, not putting out your name, but highlighting the issues on the ground. So we'll do some advocacy using some of the documentation data that has been collected, or we will do our best through advocacy to ensure that the record of what has been corrected finds its way to the mainstream of the formal TJ process. But again, not making promises is important. Also importantly, before the documentation process, it's important as well to consider using some other methods of communicating what happened with the victims. Artwork is one way. As a CSVR, we usually use what we call the river of life. I think in most of our MHPSS training workshops start right here, where we do a river of life of the participants. It becomes an easier way when someone is then describing what they have drawn, describing what has happened in their lives, almost sort of using a second-hand narrative and not saying this was done to me, or I was, and things like that. So where they explain what is happening, and that could also be another way of documenting or collecting victims' experiences at any given point. Sometimes victims find it easy to talk about their experiences from an abstract point of view, where they're describing the events outside themselves. So artwork or body mapping affords them this way of doing things. Sometimes a victim may not be able to open their mouth and talk about what happened to them, but they can draw, and you ask them about the picture. What does this represent? And they begin to speak to the picture. And through that process, you begin to get a sense of what happened to them. And then with time, then you can, at a later stage, when they have spoken to you about what each of them, the images say or represent, then you can ask, is this what happened to you? And that artwork or that drawing or any other form of art then becomes sort of the icebreaker. And the victim can then narrate what happened in a better way. So sometimes also having that, the crayons, the pencils, the paper for drawings and stuff as part of your process is important because it sort of gives the victim an abstract idea, and they come from the abstract, then end up in what happened to them. So it creates that rapport sometimes during the interview process. So what does this mean practically? That it basically means that sometimes an interview process is not a 1 hour, event where, you know, you can pick, like, to say, okay, I'll see you between 10 and 11, and then from 11:30 to 12:30, I'll see another one. In a day, I would have seen 7 people. Sometimes it doesn't work like that. You may need more time with a victim if you're collecting their stories and centering them during the process of collecting their stories, their experiences, and so forth. So sometimes it's repeat processes, sometimes it's a lot of hours in the day just getting one interview. And also importantly, it's important to also say to a victim, it is okay if you are not ready. We can document when you are. I raised this earlier. This is important when you can see, even from the onset, that the victim wants to share their experience, but they are not in a position to. They are traumatized. So you can actually say that to a victim, to say, I can see you want us to document what happened to you, but it's okay, you are not ready today. We can do this when you are. And we can then be checking on the victim until they are ready, to see if they are truly ready, or even refer them from this outset, from this outset, to say, I will refer you to someone who can help you to deal with some of the symptoms of trauma that you are presenting with. And then when you are ready, when you have better dealt with some of the immediate symptoms, the severe symptoms, then we can talk again. So leaving that door open for them to come again. So that is the before documentation. Now we are going to look at during documentation. What are some of the practical things that can be done? Perhaps also importantly before, I know we do put a lot of emphasis on the victim, but also importantly, the interviewer also needs to be ready as well. So that pre-debriefing session with a psychosocial practitioner is important for the investigator as well. In most contexts, I mean, Latin America as well, but Africa mostly, where we have worked in, and perhaps I can speak more authoritatively about Africa. The documenters, the investigators, would have experienced either directly or indirectly some of the violations, and would have been traumatized by the very same experiences. So it's very possible sometimes that as a lawyer, as a community leader, as someone, you know, who is seen as a model citizen, you could have gone through trauma as well. And it is during the documentation process that when someone is sharing, that you can actually also, as the documenter or interviewer, you start to break down, because hearing someone's trauma can also trigger your own trauma. So how you take care of yourself during the interview is important. I think one of our approaches at CSUI is that, and this we have done in a number of missions, documentation missions. Some of our partners who are here from South Sudan can attest to this as well, where before going on missions, we do provide debriefing sessions. It's a whole workshop for investigators or documenters, where we literally highlight some of the things that they are likely to face, some of the things that may trigger their own trauma, and how to contain themselves, just giving them some of the techniques, some of the strategies for containing their own trauma. But also, most importantly, and we have done this with the core group of 48 participants in South Sudan in the beginning, where we spoke about the trauma that the group of 48 that we wanted to train to become psychosocial supporters and provide psychosocial support and be a referral system during documentation. We literally went through a process of them going through their own trauma, dealing with their own trauma through a number of training workshops, because by virtue of them being South Sudanese nationals, having lived in communities where violence had taken place, and some of them are having been direct victims or have seen victimization happening to their family members, it meant that they were also traumatized, and we needed to help them to deal with their own trauma so that they can then become psychosocial supporters. They can become the referral network that can then provide these services to some of the victims identified through documentation processes. And some of those processes were quite telling in terms of how traumatized members of society, members of communities were. Sometimes even the trauma they did not know they had, trauma that even did not stem from the conflict, but stemmed from perhaps the way someone was raised, the way someone navigated adulthood, the way someone has been treated, be it in marriage or in community, a lot of other things, you know, even trauma emanating from some of the treatment in institutions of education, tertiary education, universities, amongst other things. But we needed that trauma to come to the fore so that they address it first, and that so that they can then become the referral system where others can refer to without their trauma coming in the way when they document or when they provide these services to the victims. And interestingly, most of them actually are part of the documentation initiatives in South Sudan and are better able to contain their own traumatic experiences, are better able to contain victims during documentation missions because they have dealt with their own trauma. So that I thought was also important. Now going to the during documentation practical steps, empathetic interviewing is important. What do we mean by empathetic interviewing versus clinical interviewing processes? Again, I mean, I'll keep on using the South Sudanese example because we have 6 years of doing it in South Sudan. In the beginning, when we started the process, it was lawyers, as I said before, who were doing the documentation. And I mean, I'm a lawyer myself, and perhaps I can speak also authoritatively around how sometimes we see things clinically. You know, you need your information, you need it, and you continue with the interview. You are aware of your questions and just getting answers to those questions because you have a process. So as a lawyer, I would conduct my interviews in a clinical way, but then came the socialization at CSVR, where issues now, words like empathetic interviewing, trauma-sensitive approaches to interviewing started coming up. And those were interesting perspectives and really revolutionized how I would do documentation and deal even with interviewing victims of gross human rights violations. So ensuring now that victims' feelings, emotions are part of their story, and that as an interviewer, I need to be sensitive to some of these nuances. So also importantly, for a victim, a story or an experience is not just another story. It's their reality, it's their experience, and it can be traumatic. So the interview process forces them to relive their traumatic experience. So again, what Radhika spoke about and what I also mentioned earlier, being aware of some of the emotional cues and some of the trauma responses from the victim or the interviewee during the interviewing process. Sometimes the interviewer will not come forward and say, you know, I'm traumatized, I'm experiencing traumatic experiences, but there are specific responses that tell you that the victim is currently unable to answer because they are literally reliving their trauma. So being empathetic means being aware of some of these happenings during the interview process and being able to stop the interview at any time when the victim is no longer able to continue, whether they tell you that they are no longer able to continue, or you see it through some of the emotional cues or some of the responses that they start to give you during the interview process. So it's also important to have mental health and psychosocial support services on standby during the documentation process. This is also important, and it may not always be possible, but where it's possible, it would be good to have a mental health and psychosocial support practitioner accompany the process and be on standby to provide the support, so that when you refer during the interview, the victim then does not have to walk long distances or be referred to another organization and be subjected to their waiting list to get the services that they need. So containment can happen if you have someone on standby. Again, the do no harm principles will address this during and unpack it further during the question and answer exercise that we'll have at some point where we go into groups. But again, very important, you do no harm to the victim. Ensure that all the potential harm that a victim may suffer is done away with or mitigated as best as possible, so that the victim can safely talk about what happened without having to fear about reprisals, about ostracization, and some of the stigma that may be attached to them coming forward in the first place, but also dealing with some of the security issues that may become a hindrance, or that the victim may, at the back of their minds, be thinking about during the interview process. Containment after the interview, also including referral for services, is also important. Again, here we talk about the role of the interviewer versus the role of the expert. There is what an interviewer can do. This is why it's necessary for interviewers or investigators or documenters to undergo a debriefing session, a pre-documentation mission debriefing session, so that they get to know what they can do when a victim breaks down. They get to know what techniques they can use during the interview to try and calm the interviewee down and contain the whole process where possible. Where they need to refer, they know who to refer to as well. They should know what services are available, so that you can action this during the interview, where a victim, for instance, breaks down or is unable to continue because they are reliving their trauma. Of course, the specialist will then take it forward and provide long-term and sustained support and provision of services. But as the interviewer, there's what you can do. And it's important that as an interviewer, you are trained on some of these techniques and strategies on what you can do to try and contain the situation during the interview. I promise I'm almost done. I'm taking very long. Gigi, I'm sure you've put a message already on me.
No, it's okay. It's okay. We're all very attentively listening. A very interesting presentation.
And I hope my voice is not driving everyone to sleep in the process. Okay, so now looking at after the interview process, after the documentation or interview process, some things to take note. Of course, I've spoken about the need to refer to a specialist afterwards. That is key, but some things to note as well in the aftermath of documentation or interview process. Perhaps just some of the practical things. I think it's important to note that you may not be the first one to interview or document the victim's experiences. My colleagues in a number of countries, Sudan, South Sudan, Sierra Leone, they will tell you that you try to go and interview people in those communities. They will tell you one thing, that, you know what, I've given my story to so many people. Why must I be telling you again? Are you not with that group that just finished documenting or taking my story down just 2 months ago? So sometimes there is issues around, interview fatigue, because usually the victims are the same. Although the interveners and the documentation missions may be different, But what's important, I think for me and for us as documenters, that you may not be the first one to interview or document a victim's experience, but you can become a different documenter altogether. The one that leaves a lasting impact on the documenter. The one who assists the documenter to build relationships that last with their community, with the service providers in their community who are available, and also with some of the platforms that exist that may help empower the victim. So sometimes issues around linking the victim with services, with opportunities for healing, with opportunities for sharing their experiences on other platforms, and advocacy opportunities is important. Of course, consent is key. You have to ask for the consent of the victim. So not just looking at, I mean, I remember someone was documenting in Sierra Leone and they were like, you know, documenters are now seen as ambulance chasers. You know, you want my story and you want my story, and that's the last I see or hear from you. The rest, I see my story being published in some report. No one has come back to me. No one has said anything to me. But my only interaction with you was when you wanted my story. You hounded me when you needed my story, and afterwards, I never heard back from you. In Sierra Leone, interestingly, perhaps just sharing for interest's sake, there is now documentation for hire where victims say, okay, how much are you giving me? I will only share my story with you if you can give me $300 US, because I've been sharing and nothing has happened in my life, and my life has not improved. But I see that you documenters, your reports are put out there. Some of you journalists, you have even gotten international acclaim through my story, but I have gotten nothing. So the commercialization of victims' experiences as well, where some victims say, okay, how much are you willing to give? And again, Radhika spoke about ethical considerations where it's unethical to pay for information, to pay for a victim's story, because that then also compromises a lot of things, including the truthfulness of the experience, but also just a lot of things can be compromised that way. The victim may end up telling you exactly what you want to hear, as opposed to what actually happened to them, because now money is involved. So again, the need to ensure that, coming back to the point I made, you may not be the first one, but you can be a different documenter, the one that has lasting impact, that helps the victim or the community where you are documenting, where you help them build relationships outside the ones that they had, relationships that last, linking them with services, opportunities, and other platforms for sharing their experiences, and also linking them with advocacy opportunities as well. I think this is important because, again, if we are centering victims, it means that our documentation mission also should have some positive, empowering stories as part of their end, not only the gloomy situation that victims are in. Also, sharing information with the victim is important if we are to center victims in some of the documentation processes. So not enough to simply sit with them in an interview to collect information about what happened to them or to collect their stories, but also important to go back to them after you've documented so that you fact check with them. Did I capture everything correctly? Is this a true reflection of what happened to you? And sharing these final transcripts and the final products, if it's a report, with the victims for their validation and sign off. This is important. I think this is perhaps one of the missed opportunities and one that is important for centering victims, where we ensure that the victim is included before, during, and after a documentation mission. Perhaps my parting shot is this: centering victims means that they're involved in every process, even afterwards. It's their story after all, and it cannot be complete. It cannot be completed without them. So acknowledging them and having them participate as co-authors is key to their empowerment. So again, how do you acknowledge them in your final product if it's a report? Are you going to simply leave them at anonymizing them, or are you going to acknowledge them as well as having played a key role in the documentation process? Because documentation without the interviewee, without their experiences, cannot happen. So they are basically the right, left, and center of the documentation process. So acknowledging them contributes to the empowerment, but also very much so is part of centering victims in the documentation processes. Thank you.
Anna, thank you so much. I have a few questions on the chat box if you want me to read. Let me just read before you, or I don't know how you intend to do the session. You're going to do a Q&A, you want to break? How do you want to do it?
We can just do the questions now, and then we'll break out where we can then share some more.
Okay.
And then perhaps I will share also the questions. How much time, Shishi, do I have?
We still have about 40 minutes.
Okay.
Okay.
Great. I think we can take questions now, and then perhaps use the questions that I drafted for us to share a little bit better.
Okay, all right. So I'm going to read the comments and questions on the chat box. So from Farida, good evening. I'm Farida Oklisi from the Families of Forcibly Disappeared People Coordination Committee in Algeria. Our experience in documentation had a positive side and a negative side. The positive side is that it was easy to gain the victim's trust, considering the documenting person himself a victim. But this has a negative impact as the victim documents for another victim. I mean, they experienced similar things. So that's one comment. Then Nana Jo also comments, thanks, Anna, for highlighting issues of documenters not engaging with those who share their stories after they have shared their stories. And then Farida has a second message. Let me just see here, because there's a previous message from Wasila, which is the one I read. No, there's a first message here from Wasila, because then Farida references this message. So Wasila is saying it is crucial to have a psychologist at the hearing or documentation. Revisiting the details of the traumatic event, particularly sexual violence, has psychological, emotional, and even behavioral impacts that may be so intense as to make one have suicidal thoughts, especially in conservative societies. So this is one comment that Wasila had made, and then Farida references the comment below, saying what Wasila mentioned about rape victims is something we faced a lot in our conservative societies. The victims refuse to reveal what happened to them, especially the women. We have gone through very painful cases, but the victims refuse to speak before rape is a matter that harms the victim and her family, and thus the victim continues to suffer without resorting to the documentation that is backed with psychological treatment. So those were two comments, and do you want to talk to these? Because there's also another one which I can read, or do you want to comment to these and then I'll read the other comments?
Thank you, Shishi. I can perhaps also comment on these ones, and then we take another one. I agree with what Farida has said, and perhaps also bring in the danger of the victim interviewing another victim, because this then triggers what I spoke about earlier, the traumatic memories for the interviewer. And in a worst case scenario, the interviewer ends up breaking down. That's why I was stressing as well the need for those debriefing sessions, and also even having the interviewer deal with their own traumatization first before they can interview someone else. But also very much what Farida said, there is that rapport when the interviewer says, I have also suffered a similar violation as you. So that creates that bond between the interviewer and the interviewee, causing the interviewee to speak more openly about what happened to them, because they know that it's something that resonates with the interviewee. So it has both those, but there is, I can't emphasize enough the need then for both the interviewer and the interviewee to then seek this psychosocial support afterwards, so that both of them get contained and then they get the psychosocial services in order to heal from their own experiences as well. So it's important for the interviewer in this setting to then seek also psychosocial support for him or herself as well, not just for the victim, for the interviewee. On the one that was on the second
GBV
message,
on
yes.
sexual cases of rape.
Yes, or Farifa's second message, yes, definitely. So that's what I also spoke about earlier, to say that the victim may not be able to speak because the consequences of speaking for the victim, the price that the victim has to pay afterwards, after speaking, may be too heavy. So for instance, in one of the projects that we have done with ICSC, one of the challenges, so we're looking at children born out of war and victims of conflict-related sexual violence, some of the challenges. So women, in some of the countries where we did interviews in Nigeria, for instance, came forward saying that for them to speak openly about their rape will mean that they have to lose their marriages, they have to lose, for instance, their homes, and this is a price that they just are not able to pay. The same happened in the Gambia as well. Most women did not come forward because the backlash was that they were now going to be chased away by their husbands, who then know for the first time that they've been raped, and the husbands will never look at them the same way. For women who had children born out of rape, again, the issues were also separate as well. They faced ostracization from their communities. So some of them who came pregnant from the bush and then went back to their homes, discovered that they were pregnant. They did not disclose this to their husbands for fear of being chased away with their children. So they literally let the husband believe that this is their child, to protect their own dignity, to protect their standing in society, and to protect their marriages. So women really face a lot. And in most instances, they don't talk about their experiences. But what we have found powerful in encouraging women to speak about their experiences is to create some of these women-only networks or safe spaces for women, or safe networks for women to talk openly and freely about their experiences, taking away the documentation aspect out completely, but have women share their similar experiences in a safe space. And then with time, together they co-create a safer way of communicating their experiences in ways that have them being anonymous, but also in ways that then that do not identify them, but the issues have been brought to the fore and issues are being addressed, and particular services are being given to the women. So some women, for instance, will meet every Thursday where, you know, they'll say, no, we have this social group. And some of the Stokvels here in South Africa actually have been built around that, where women meet monthly. And of course, as a Stokvel, they're making these contributions towards their economic empowerment, but those have also become spaces where women share some of their GBV cases, their rape cases, their sexual violence cases. And these spaces have now also become safe spaces where they bring in your psychosocial practitioner to give them advice, but also to counsel them as a group and provide some of the services and empower them. So for them, their safety, their marriages are safe, but the issues, their own trauma is being addressed through some of these, what can I call them? Informal processes that we bring women together for social purposes, but they're now having this added layer where women find this as a safe place. So even when they leave home to these spaces, their husbands don't ask them, because it's expected that, okay, you are going to your Stokvel. So they found these to be useful and successful. So sometimes thinking out of the box around how can we protect women, but at the same time, ensure that their stories, their experiences are also documented, but at the same time that they get the services that they so need.
Okay, thank you so much, Ana. Let me read Pamela Impiza's comment from Chile. So hello, Pamela here from Museum of Memory and Human Rights in Chile. Considering the material conditions here in Latin America for those of us who do memory work and who do not always have psychological support teams, how can we provide safe spaces for those who give their testimonies if they don't have access to this kind of support?
Yeah. Thank you, Pamela, for that question. It's an important one. I think one way we can perhaps ensure that these services, no matter how, even though minimum, can be provided to victims, would be for the documenters to undergo this process, these workshops that I spoke about earlier, that CSVR has provided to the South Sudanese documenters, where they deal with their own trauma, but at the same time, before going into missions, they have a workshop that deals with pre-mission debriefing on what they can encounter, how they can be the first line of response as documenters in providing containment and some basic psychosocial services to victims for purposes of containing them. Our team does what we call psychological first aid, you know, borrowing from first aid. You know, first aid is when you have that box. I don't know if it's the same everywhere in the world, but it was administered by the Red Cross, so I'm assuming it's the same. You have a box that gives you your basic medication, you know, for a quick response when something happens, but you still need to refer to the hospital for your serious cases. So we do also psychological first aid for documenters so that they are able to respond to cases in the field and mitigate some of the more harmful ways of trauma that victims may be presenting with. And this way there is that response, even though for long-term sustained support and services for victims, this can come from professionals. So perhaps that would be one way for your documenters from Chile to come forward and get some of these psychological first aid skills so that they can then become that first responder, or even get a group of other people in the community to undergo this process so that they can then become a referral system, providing this psychological first aid to victims so that we also don't burden the documenters on the investigators.
Thank you so much, Ana. I'm going to read the comment from Radhika here. You also don't need to have the support structure within your organization. You can develop a referral system that builds on the strength of other organizations or counseling programs. I also wanted to say, as a museum practitioner and as part of the ICSC team as well, we in March 2020, I did a program with Lebo and Gugu Chabalala from CSVR. We did a talk in a conference with museums exactly on the need for memory initiatives and museums to start understanding that psychosocial support or psychological support is a need that they need to build within their structures, because as a key component, not as a nice to have. Because once we understand that within the universe that we deal, the histories that we deal, and the memories that we deal, that this is not a nice to have. This is a real necessity if you're doing your work responsibly. Then you make it a key necessity and you prioritize it. But it takes some education, and it's part of the changing role of memory initiatives and museums around the world. But I think it's something to consider within our initiatives. And also there is another comment here from Nana Jo. Great workshop, definitely helpful for the work we do at Memory House at the Gambia. So she has to see, but I share the Padlets with the team, and she's just excusing herself. Nana Jo has to leave, but thank you for a great workshop. And I think these are all the comments that we had in the chat box. So how do you want to proceed?
Thank you. So I had a few questions. Perhaps we could also work on this in the plenary just to save time, Gigi.
Okay.
I
Elena,
helps put up the questions. I don't know if you have the questions, Sylvia. If you
yes, Elena has pasted them earlier on the chat box, but I'm going to ask Elena, please, can I ask you the favor to repaste it here in the chat box?
Maybe it's more useful. The questions are pasted on the Padlet. I'm going to share it because I think you will be able to see it more clearly there. I'm also going to paste them on the chat.
I could also just share the document.
Yes, no, I think Elena will paste the questions. I will also just read one more comment that was placed. There's a comment from Wasila again, but it's in Arabic. So I will just, I believe Justine has translated. So I advise the interviewer to practice some relaxation techniques to face any emergency. My work as a psychiatrist makes me keen on this point in particular, because some of these techniques may reduce the state of tension experienced by the victim as she tells the story, as well as avoiding the panic attack that is common in such cases. So this is another message from Wasila.
Thank you, Wasila.
And here we have the questions in the chat box, and Elena's pasting in the different languages. Anna, do you want me to read the questions for you, and then we can get it? I'm going to put I've got my image on the screen, and if you guys, because I think you stopped sharing your screen, I think you think it's better for us to be able to look at each other, right, and have a conversation.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first question was share some of your practical examples of how you have put victims at the center of documentation and memorialization storytelling processes. I think the questions are out there now on the chat box. Anna, I don't know if you can hear me. You are muted. So if you're speaking, we can't hear you.
Sorry, Gigi, I'm busy talking on my side. I muted myself. Yes. This is really to allow us to have an interactive session and also to hear from everyone how they have navigated some of these experiences and how they've also brought innovation to the work that they do during documentation. So the floor is open for everyone to share some experiences. So anyone can share. I don't know. I think they can only share in the chat box, Gigi, right? Is it?
They can share in the chat box, but no, they can speak as well. They can raise their hand.
As well. Oh, perfect.
Yes. Yeah.
So
and
the
I'm
floor
going
is open. Yeah.
Yeah, the floor is open, and I'm going to ask also our correcting the record participants to maybe lead the contributions.
Great.
Okay, Nebojsa Milikic, I hope I said your name right. Go ahead, please.
Yes, correctly. Thank you. I'm from Cultural Center X, Fund B92 from Belgrade. And I'm really very grateful for the analysis and the presentation of experiences as far as I managed to catch everything. I had some unexpected obligation today, so I wasn't there for the beginning. I would like to share one piece of experience with working with the poorest of the poor, let's say in today's Belgrade, in today's let's say, politics and policy of social policy that is in charge for solving the most harsh housing problems. So this is one sort of a ghetto consisting of new flats, new buildings, and with prevailingly Roma minority being settled there, with incredible problems. They simply cannot pay any form of rent, which is subsidized, but again, they cannot pay for running costs, and up to 200 families are already for 10 years in a daily fear of being evicted from their flats. Now, what I want to share, we made many interviews with them. There is, of course, like in all such situations, extremely normalized violence, whether systematic, whether on a personal level, on a family level, of patriarchy that somehow tends to present itself as like the last standing piece of order and organization. So extremely sensitive situation. So we had a problem of interviewing many of those inhabitants. So what we offered to them, this is maybe interesting. We said, we cannot help you. We don't know how hard it is for you. We will stay here, and we are there already for 7-8 years. We will come always when there is something traumatic going on. Only thing that we can change is to make media, mainstream media, change narrative about you. Through your stories, this narrative will not be anymore as it was in the beginning. Oh, these spoiled users of this social support, they don't want to work, they don't want even to pay. The narrative has to be something completely different. So this is what we were working on, and we asked from them to invest their trust and their to say, I cannot say, but it is still also their trauma, into changing this landscape and the narrative, a dominating narrative about their position. I can say that we partly also succeeded, but then the question is what else? And of course, entire community tends to also not to risk introspection in detail, what is going on, who is a little bit in some soft criminal, or who is in a breach of this or another law. I mean, it's so sensitive, but our offer was, as a cultural center, to try to change the basic general narrative about their situation. And I think that we only a week ago, the main weekly in Serbia, main liberal weekly, published article on 5 pages about that settlement, which is really great. It was not perfect narrative, but it is total change. And what we are doing also for a few years, we are doing a reading group. We now, this is about paying. We pay to poor people to read books. We really pay. I mean, it's not any serious money, but we give them honorary to do analysis. This is how we justify it. This is not, it is quotation mark, but they're like not needed there. We really need analysis. For example, take Charles Dickens' novel. How we see it, like middle-class people that can, get introduced to the social misery of that time, but how they see it, how trustworthy narrative, how trustworthy messages are there from their position. So it was incredible. And through that work, some of them simply developed their capacity to struggle for change of basic narrative. Okay, this is what I wanted to share. Maybe it's not totally, for sure, it's not in a trace of this sophisticated and very, very useful analysis, but I think that it is some experience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nebojsa. Farida, go ahead.
مساء الخير أهلا
Good
وسهلا.
evening. Frankly speaking, this is a good experience for us that gave us some hints based on your experiences, and we will use them as guides. I just want to say that we had an experience through restoring the memories by using the memory boxes that the abducted people are not numbers, but they are stories and the memories that are left for their relatives. So what we have done in our experience, we tried by the relatives of the abductees with the remnants of their abductees, like photos, clothes, anything that is related to them. And the story they narrated to us, it was so impactful because we lived through the experience of this family, the suffering of this family along the past years. For example, these abductees left some things behind them.
وبالتالي كان شعارنا في هذا في هذه التجربة أن اختطاف شخص واحد هو تعذيب أسرة بأكملها. يعني هذا طبعا شيء من
sorry Farida, 1 second, we lost the interpretation, the Arabic English interpretation. Can you just go back a little bit? Ahmed, is everything okay? I think Ahmed is muted. Okay, good. Well, please, Farida, go ahead.
I repeat?
Yes, please repeat, because we lost a big piece of what you said.
Okay.
I'm on now. So I was saying that we had an experience, we had a narrative experience through the preservation of memory and by the exposition of memory boxes. So this action was done in cooperation with the Center for Memory and Archives. During this action, during this work of memory boxes, we did this to ensure that the abductees or the kidnapped are not just numbers, but they are stories, they are individual memories left by those victims.
Going to ask communities, to people from the groups we are working, we are doing some promises. This is not concrete promises. I understood that from the presentation of Anna, but I wanted to hear more about other people, what they feel about this, because an example I wanted to share from Migration Museum was a project we made with migrant women in São Paulo, who was organized in these last years in collectives, in groups, in social mobilization about women in migration here that comes mostly from these groups were mostly from our continent. So countries like Bolivia, Peru, who are living here in São Paulo, and they felt that their demands, their issues was not represented even in the groups that were working about migration issues here in São Paulo. So they looked to the museum and to register these stories. One place to to make more and knowledgeable these issues that is not listened even in these groups. So and in this point, I think that there was one important question that we asked to all the participants, that was, to you, what is to be an immigrant woman in Brazil in these days? So this was the question that opened many different responses, but was an important moment to their open issues about schooling of their children, and how is the immigrant woman who goes to understand more what is happening in the school, and the health issues. So I think also in their interviews we have some question about what do you think about this concept we are talking about, that can open sometimes a very interesting exchanges. Sorry for my bad communication here, but I tried. Let's see if you could understand me.
Thanks, Thiago. That was perfect. I will also pass the word to Pamela from Chile, and then Anna maybe can comment. We are going to we have another 7 minutes to wrap the session, so I think that will be enough time for everybody. Go ahead, Pamela.
Hi, Gigi and Anna. Can I tell my experience in Spanish too?
Yes, there's translation. You go ahead in Spanish.
Great. Bueno, nada, contarles.
All right. Well, I want to tell you in general terms that our experience in the Museum for Memory and Human Rights is also connected to our political practices as workers in that area, and the processes of feminizing the narrative or incorporating perspectives of gender in what is shared by the museum. And it has been mobilized by the workers themselves from the place. So we have a direct relation with those who bear witness, because we are part of the same community. And that's why, as I was mentioning a while ago, we count with psychological teams, and generally it's very difficult or at times impossible. So we have, more than anything, we have a network of women that contain each other. And when we have difficult times in the meaning of testimonies, or putting those testimonies out there in the space, in other words, dignifying the testimonies and giving them a place with subjects of political violence, sexual violence, we have made this process. Pamela, just a second. Tiago is saying,
porque estás en el
it's because you are on the Spanish channel. So I think you need to select original channel, main audio. Yeah, put it on main audio. Great. All right, perfect.
No, it's okay.
And anyways, so I'd like to make that distinction because we work in memory spaces. Now, what it means, the material connections, for example, to follow up or to render some kind of economic help to those that are part of our programs, or those who are sharing their testimony, or victims who are participating in the things that we do. It's basically impossible. So, that's a reality that is not there. Not only do we need to open up the space for the stories that have been historically included, but also we have to give validity to the work that we do before the institutional challenges. And, the institutions, they make the work a little more difficult to be able to install it as a testimony. So from the museum, we have approximately 4 years building on different processes for diagnosis to be able to give some kind of validity, institutional validity, and be able to carry out a museographic to incorporate the testimonies of women and the testimonies of sexual diversities. There were other testimonies within the official narrative of the museum, which is a memory of a country. So I think that that is important as a, to comment it, because not only do we need to bear in some way with the meaning of what it is for the victims to, to share their memories, but also we have to validate those memories and towards the institutions, because generally speaking, the stories that are shared when there's a breaking point because of historical trauma and terrible violation of human rights is that those stories are of a patriarchy character, and therefore, generally, they are Anglo-centrical visions that are, made more visible, and therefore, I feel like there's an intersectionality in the work that we do, because it is basically crossed by other things that are not, very concrete in as to what happened in the story, but also how they are memorialized, and that memory is always at dispute with society and with institutions that we work with.
Gracias, Pamela. Thank you so much. I just wanted to ask also, Abdullah Salam, did you want to say something, because you raised your hand and then you lowered, so I'm not sure it was Zoom or you. Is Abdullah still here? Because sometimes his internet also falters. Okay. Okay. All right. So I will pass the word again. Abdullah, you're there. Hi.
I'm afraid I can't hear the speaker very well. Can you hear me now? Yes. So I was very happy I can't hear the speaker. Very, very bad connection. You can listen to Arabic directly and see how difficult it is.
Hear you.
فلن أخيب ظنها يعني فمن خلال تفضل.
We can't hear you at all. Your voice is very difficult.
المعذرة الإنترنت عندي ضعيف جدا.
I do apologize. He says the internet connection is quite bad. I have like connectivity problems. I can't speak very well, he says.
Okay, no problem. I'm sorry about that. Abdullah.
Maybe he can try again. He's trying and it sounds a little bit better now.
Okay, let's go.
هل الصوت الآن مسموع؟ أنا سعيد أولاً أنا آسف جداً إنه.
So first of all, I would like to apologize. And I cannot make, I cannot add comments, so I'll talk to you as often as I would have wanted to. But I'm enjoying listening to you and listening to these presentations by the speakers. And this is like a very complicated issue. We have an experience in this regard with regard to documentation of violations of human rights, particularly with women. So we had a problem, particularly during the interviews and the documentation work that we do, particularly when we deal with women victims. So the main challenges and the difficulties are that a lot of women refuse to share their stories or to have their stories documented. And they would only talk about the event and give a general idea about what happened without any details or any nuances about what particularly had actually happened, especially with regard to sexual violations. So all the victims would only give a general idea about what they've been exposed to without referring to any details. But generally speaking. Unfortunately, we still have to go a long way in this regard, because most of the victims refuse even to talk about any such experiences of sexual violence. I believe we need to train these women, or train other women, to try and break this silence barrier, to encourage them, encourage those victims of violence, and particularly those women who have been affected by such violations, so that we can encourage them and encourage victims to come forward and talk about the experiences they have shared, because we are still we still live under an ongoing war, and violations continue on a daily basis in Yemen. So we need also to talk about a recovery. We still have a long way to go in this regard, as I said. Thank you very much for allowing me to share this this opinion of mine very quickly, and sorry again for the connectivity problems that I have been having.
Thank you so much, Abdullah, for persevering and letting us hear your contribution. So I am now going to call Anna to close the session, because I think we reached the end of our time. So just for you to wrap up, the floor is yours again, Anna. And I cannot hear you or see.
Thank you,
Okay,
Gigi. Thank you, Gigi, and thank you so much, everyone. I acknowledge the different experiences that have been shared from museums and also from working with victims on the ground, shared by participants on this platform, and just some of the innovation and some of the challenges that you are facing in doing some of this work in just the memorialization in museums and the documentation missions on the ground. And again, thank you to ICSC for also giving me this opportunity for us to share some of what has been coming up in the work that we do, and how we can together look at centering victims and ensuring that this becomes a reality in the work that we are doing. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Anna. Sorry. Thank you, Anna. Thank you so much for the session. I think the sequence of your session, Lebo, Radhika, and your session, they were flowing very well into each other and complementing each other in terms of the concepts and the ideas and tools presented. These are such complex topics, but you also touched in such sophisticated approaches, and I have given, I think, us a lot of food for thought. So I'd like to thank you all very much, and thank you, Anna, so much for your session. And now, with a little bit of delay, we have about 25 minutes to close our session. It's my pleasure to introduce the last session of the day, which is going to be a little bit shortened, but I think we covered some of the ground. I'd like to call my two colleagues at the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience, Silvia Fernandez, Global Networks Program Director, and Dario Colmenares Milan, Program Director of the Global Transitional Justice Initiative at the Coalition. Dario and Silvia, they will guide us on some Sites of Conscience examples in centering community voices. They will be presenting the Living Archives Toolkit that was developed by the Global Transitional Justice Initiative, and examples of community-led oral archives projects, and maybe, if we have time, a brief overview of some methodologies such as body mapping. So I'll pass the word to Dario and Silvia.
Thank you so much, Jay. I'll try to be very brief because I'm conscious of time. I know that we are cut up by time, but then I'll try to very quickly go through the main points that I would like that I wanted to share with you. As GIJTR announced, well, we had developed this over the last couple of years, this toolkit called Living Archives. I'll just give you a very brief background of where it comes from, how it was put together. This is a result of our activities in the Colombia project, supporting the transitional justice process in Colombia. And very specifically, it began with training on developing oral archives, which we hosted together with member sites Memoria Abierta, Parque por la Paz Villa Grimaldi, Memoria Abierta from Argentina, Villa Grimaldi from Chile, and also Centro de Memoria Monseñor Gerardi from Guatemala. 3 of the sites in the Latin American network of sites of conscience that have a very vast experience in developing archives and in archival techniques. So the training was originally intended for those CSOs, these civil society organizations, who already had archives and a very well structured archival practice, but they were more centered in paper archives, and well, they had many materials or many interviews that they had collected in the past in documenting human rights. They didn't have them properly organized, digitalized, or organized in a catalog for accessibility from the researchers and the general public. So their first challenge was to develop a method to put these existing oral archives together into a collection of searchable archives. At the same time, we also invited other organizations which had started this process very more recently, and some of them were interested in developing an oral archive based in interviews with the communities and putting it together and having it become legacy for their community in the future, but that hadn't started the process. So that was the main challenge at the beginning. We brought these 3 expert organizations to the training and to roundtables, and it was very interesting because we were able to develop some insights into the more specific conditions that we find in the Colombian context. And because in general, most of the oral archives and testimonial archives for Memorialization that we are all familiar with and are obviously victim-centered, but there was a new component in the Colombia context, which is there are some gray areas between victims and or victims that have been participating in armed groups, which have been in turn perpetrators. So we had some of the people interviewed or interviewees had the double condition of victim and if not direct perpetrators, sometimes participant in a group of perpetrators, and that was difficult to handle by the schemes that we had developed in the past, because that's another kind of testimony. And also we had other fair amount of these interviews were conducted with witnesses and informed witnesses, especially informed witnesses from the side of the local governments. So it is a very interesting and varied range of interviewees that we were dealing with in developing oral archives in Colombia. So this started as a training with them, and then in these discussions we developed a local expert group in Colombia, and with the 3 organizations, Villa Grimaldi, Memoria Abierta, Monseñor Gerardi, and the local experts from the Colombia context, we developed this toolkit. And the purpose of the toolkit is that many of these discussions are obviously interesting for other practitioners, activists, sites across the world. And we wanted to share that knowledge. Of course, it's not exhaustive, but it goes into detail in many aspects that may be of interest for other organizations developing oral archives across the across the world. So it contains, I will very quickly go through the contents, not the contents, because it is a 100-page toolkit, and I invite you all to review or to read it, to go through it, and come back with questions if you want. Of course, we'd be very interested in addressing those. And I guess somebody shared it in the chat. I'm not looking at the chat at the moment, but I'm sure we have been sharing it over the chat. And so here you find the thorough discussions on principles that already have been mentioned by Radhika and by Anna in very interesting panels that we heard just a while ago. Security issues, ethics, and informed consent. And in relation to informed consent, there's something in there. There are all kinds of specific details about that, but I would just like to mention something that hasn't been mentioned and that could be particularly relevant, is that when you collect the informed consent in developing the interviews, you may have an idea of how the information will be used, and but that may not be the case in the future, because maybe 3 years after the interview there will be a truth commission or different political scene, so maybe other institutions will be launched, and the informed consent, if you want to use it for that purpose of the informing the truth commission, which is created 5 years after the interview, then you would need to go back to the interviewees and get the updated informed consent. That has proved impossible when we're talking about large collections. There's a case in Colombia where there was 6,000 interviews collected by women in the Ruta Pacífica por la Memoria. Ruta Pacífica developed Truth Commission of Women. That's a civil society truth commission of the truth from the point of view of women in the conflict. And when they needed, when the Truth Commission was created, maybe that was some 10 years after that, the current Truth Commission, which will close their mandate in a couple of months. So they were not able to use many of these interviews because they were not able to reach the actual interviewees. Some of them had died, some of them had moved and been displaced, and it was nearly impossible. It proved nearly impossible to reach out to all those interviewees. So that's something to also be considered. And when you develop the informed consent, you need to be open enough to understand the use of the interview. And in fact, I have it in another slide, but as we are short of time, I'll just jump to it. And there's something important in considering the difference between an interview collected for accountability. This one, the archiving for accountability and archiving for memorization and advocacy. Most of the archives and oral archives that you have mentioned here are addressing memorization and advocacy, and the purpose of the collection of the interviews is to disseminate, even though anonymized or however they are prepared to be disseminated to the public, but the information being disseminated to the public is very important in mostly all the examples that we have seen before. But it is very important to consider that interviews collected with that purpose may be useless for accountability purposes sometimes, because the accountability process is you know that there's the attorney, but there's also the defense of the perpetrator, of the accused, who will have access to these interviews, and if they can be associated with memorialization campaign and advocacy campaign, that has a different view of the than the like the general, for example, government view, then they can invalidate that because they can claim that this interview is biased, even if the interview is not biased, even if the interview is fully truthful, faithful to truth, it will still be when presented on court, it will be rendered biased because it was used in the context of an advocacy campaign against, for example, those from the same party of the accused. So that kind of questioning renders these testimonies useless for accountability, and that's something that is very important to be considered. The other thing is that in accountability processes, in judicial processes, there is a big problem when there are when the interviewee has provided the same or not the same, or has provided interviews for different different organizations and different contexts. If there has been more than one interview, then the precise information delivered in one of the interviews may be slightly different from the information collected in the other interview, maybe 7 or 10 years after that. And then that will make it useless for accountability, because that will make it useless as evidence, because there are contradictions in the testimonies, even if they have been produced several years in difference. So I see that I'm running out of time. We can just go through the slides, through the 3 slides. Let's go back, and you will see some of the topics that you will find in this toolkit. Let's go back, and so you will find the previous one. I will very quickly go through it. Okay, so principles, selection of the universe of interviewees and teams, because that's something that is important for the organization, understanding the nature of their own archive. Next. Let's go to the next slide, please. Also, you'll find information on protocols for the interviews. Some of them have been mentioned in the previous presentations, and also the documentation handling for security and for and the protocol for access with making sure that nobody is unduly exposed beyond the informed consent. Then there's a section on selection and training of interviewers and technical support, because as you will may understand, not only interviewers, but also the technical support, the person operating a camera, for example, if the interview is collected in camera or whatever, all the technical people need to be trained also to handle these situations. They need to have a basic training on psychosocial support, on avoiding leading questions, on a number of aspects. So there's a section on that. There's another section on the background research. Next, go to the next one. And there's, well, we were discussing this difference between archiving for accountability and for memorialization, but I'll also mention the difference between a digital archive and a database, which is very relevant in this case. In the pictures, we see the archive of Centro de Memoria Monseñor Gerardi in Guatemala. They were collected in interviews and in audio, in tapes, and then it was classified and cataloged into a database. Basically, the great difference is that the archive contains the full information, the full record, or the full transcription, all the documents. But the database is a selection of the information inside the documents based on a thesauri, which is a conceptual tool developed for the cataloging of the information. Next, we can jump very quickly to speak about the Monsignor Gerardi Center for Memory. Next, that was developed by the Archbishopric of Guatemala at a moment when there was no Truth Commission in place. And the good thing about this is that they collected over 8,000 testimonies across Guatemala. And when the Truth Commission was established, the Truth Commission couldn't do less than that, because there was already a precedent on what the Catholic Church had developed. But the other thing that that's why I mentioned the Catholic Church being behind this because they offered the structure that they had, because they had parishes all across Guatemala. So they had people all across Guatemala. It was easy for them to create the network of interviewers and train them in a consistent way. And with these community facilitators that were trained by the Catholic Church, they conducted the interviews in Mayan languages, and they recorded them in audios. And some of these interviewers were also trained in transcription techniques and the tagging of the transcriptions. But it required several years and the whole structure of the Catholic Church. And that means that there is always a structure behind the collection of the interviews. If you are going to collect only 10, 12 interviews, okay, maybe a small organization can handle that. But if the amount of interviews is 200, 300 and above that, the great challenge there is that you will need a robust structure behind that, but also the question of ownership comes into play, because the community will no longer be, well, I mean, if it is also a question if it is a small organization with 10 interviews, because you say, well, you may believe that the ownership of the archives and of the testimonies, of the interviews, relies on the community, on the interviewees. But that's not true. That's not completely true, because somebody else, which is not the interviewees, is hosting that information in their server, in their in-house, or on paper, or wherever. But it is being, the access is being controlled by a third party, even if the third party belongs to the community. So that's a big question that arises here. Next. We can go to the next. Okay. And something related to what was mentioned previously about the challenges of languages. The interviews were collected in Mayan languages and then transferred into the transcript was made in Spanish by the facilitators, and after that it was subject to another process called the tagging, where by specialized professionals, and this tagging procedure allowed them to develop those archives into a database. There are other cases, and I will mention that, where oral archives are not collected in audio. Oral archives can be collected on paper. And how is that? For example, we have examples from Humanitarian Law Center, one of our partners in Serbia in this case, and so they developed an archive, a testimonial archive, not only for Serbia but all the Balkans, collected without the use of audio devices, because they expressly decided that that was the best methodological procedure for them. So what they did is they interviewed the person, and there was somebody transcribing the interview, and then the contents of the interview, the transcription direct from the voice to the text, was then reviewed with the interviewee and validated by the interviewee, and then it had evidentiary admissibility before courts. So that was the purpose, that was the reason why it was collected in that way. Next. Okay, so the preservation of audio originals, transcripts, and additional documents requires a certain expertise. We discussed these in the toolkit. It deserves a detailed workshop on these issues, and there's a lot to say about this. And I also mentioned about the cataloging and the use of the thesauri and the access software and protocols. All of these deserve many questions. I very quickly went through an example of of one of our sites, the database Guatemala Nunca Más, developed by the Archbishopric of Guatemala, the Centro de Memoria, or Center for Memory, Monsignor Gerardi, as an example of something very much related to the toolkit. I won't take up more time because I'm aware of our shortage of time. Thank you for your patience, Gigi, Sylvia, and everybody.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Dario. We gave you an impossible mission to like run through everything in such a short, it got squeezed by time. I'm sorry about that. I'm going to pass the word to Sylvia. I'm just going to read the last comment by Radhika in the box about informed consent. She says, I absolutely agree. I went back to get consent when I was putting together a book, and some people pulled their stories from the archive. But that is how it is. The right is theirs, and informed consent means they're actually informed enough to change their minds. So this is a question. And then there's a question by Remy. I will, okay, there was a translation here. So my question is if the network can organize a training on archiving, interview, and documenting. I will pass the word to Sylvia because I think Sylvia can briefly respond that before she speaks her part. Sil.
Thank you, JJ. Thank you everyone for being here today. Sorry, I realized my camera is off. We are running a little bit late, so I will not be too long with the body mapping example because we share the toolkit and everyone has the toolkit. And it's actually an excellent guide to understand what body mapping is and to help facilitate body mapping sessions. So I will basically say that body mapping is an alternative art and memory methodology that helps community and survivors write and draw their experiences of trauma, conflict, or violence on life-size representations of their body. Body mapping, I don't think Shirley Gunn is with us right now, but basically Shirley Gunn, who is the director of the Human Rights Center, one of our coalition members in South Africa. Over the years, she has been working with communities and coalition members around the world, facilitating these body mapping workshops. And body mapping is actually a response to the strong need for more inclusive, comprehensive, and community-led mechanisms in dealing with the past. The toolkit that you can access in the Padlets will, like I said, it will show how the methodology works and how can you actually facilitate these sessions. Body mapping is both an artistic and a group therapy technique. The goal is to provide a safe vehicle through which people can share traumatic experiences with each other, building support for victims' rights and for the inclusion of memorialization processes in official truth and reconciliation recommendations. As a technique is the depiction of someone's entire life journey from childhood to an envisioned future. The process is broken down into a series of creative exercises that ask participants to visualize their past and future to create a life-size map of their bodies. You can see some of the body maps here in the images. By linking past to future, participants map the physical effects of their experiences, whether they are scars, injuries, and pain inflicted during the trauma, while sketching their support systems and points of strength. As Shirley herself noted, the methodology does not only look at trauma and victimhood, but also at resilience. During the body mapping sessions, participants are encouraged to reflect on the physical and emotional effects of trauma and how to show this on their body maps. That's why, in most life-size body maps, you can see both literal representations, for example, broken bones, and also symbolic representations like barbed wire around the heart. As a group process, body mapping participants share their different experiences with fellow participants through different stages of the workshop. This approach enables survivors and community members to see themselves and locate their traumatic individual experience with a broader communal experience. We at the coalition have used this technique widely with diverse group of participants, enabling them to come to terms with physical and emotional trauma. While each body mapping workshop is different, all sessions offer a mix of discussion, quiet painting, sharing, and listening. And the group actually, as a technique, the body mapping provides a safe vehicle for people and community members to share difficult stories with each other, and if they choose so, with the wider public. Actually, at the end of each workshop, each body map is hung on the wall, and each participant is invited to introduce his or her body map, explain to the group and share how they felt painting it and how they feel now sharing it with others. And then the group collectively decides any follow-up activities they want to undertake, whether to leave the body maps and organize exhibits around them, or or just take them with them individually. So we at the coalition have found that the body mapping technique is very effective in many ways. But if I have to choose a few bullet or main ideas, I will say that we have found it very effective in allowing communities to make the journey from a past of repression and violence to envision a future of peace and justice, recognizing and supporting victims, allowing multiple interpretations and representations of both collective and personal of past events, and creating a public historical record that can actually educate future generations through exhibits, publications, and intergenerational dialogue. I'm completely aware that this was rushed. I'm not the expert either, so the intention was never to get into details, but rather just give an overview of the technique and be able to share it with those of you who may be looking for alternative ways to collect personal stories. Like I said, the toolkit is available on our website in the toolkits, and if anyone has any questions, as always, the channels of communications are open. Remy, I haven't forgotten about your question. Yes, we are actually, so we did a workshop on transformative documentation back in December 2020, but we realized that there is a strong need coming from members to go deeper and expand trainings on documentation and archiving. So yes, we are now working on developing a curriculum and figuring out the content of future workshops. Oof, I don't know if there were any questions, any urgent questions or comments. Okay, so before handing it over to Justine, who is going to close, I just want to thank everyone for being here. I want to thank the Correcting the Record, the 6 sites of conscience that are working on this project and helping develop a methodology that will help all sites of conscience around the world. And I want to thank my team who has been working tirelessly on this project and putting together this workshop. So thank you, everyone. Justine, over to you. Rosario, I think some are in Spanish, so let me check, and we will share them as well. Thank you, everyone. Justine,
thank you. Yeah, thank you, Sylvia. So I will just say a few words about the next step. So the second virtual capacity building global workshop, Correcting the Record, will be held on November 29 and November 30th. So it will disseminate the collective knowledge produced by the Correcting the Record project, and will serve as a peer-to-peer learning platform to showcase the impact of the 6 case studies in amplifying the stories of those who had been excluded from mainstream narratives. So during this workshop, global members will have the opportunity to exchange with the Correcting the Record methodology firsthand, and also offer critical input before we complete the final Correcting the Record toolkit. And this final toolkit will be shared with the Global Sites of Conscience community through the ICIC Resource Center around February 2023. And it will be available in English, Spanish, French, and Arabic. So that's it for the next step. And I will also thank you all for participating in the workshop, for contributing to the discussion and sharing your very interesting experiences. A big thank you to Lebo, Radhika, and Hannah for their excellent presentation, and also thank you to the interpreters. And I just would like to remind you to take a few minutes to answer our survey. We would be very grateful if you could fill out them, as they are crucial to evaluate our work and to plan for our programming. And the link is in the chat box. Yes, Elena, can you put the link in the chat box?
On my.
Okay, thank you, Elena. So Elena will post them on the chat. So many thanks for coming, and have all a great day or a great evening. Thank you very much again.
Many thanks, everyone. It was a fantastic workshop. Thank you. Thank you for everybody for your contributions, the speakers and the attendees. Thank you.
And please, please, please take 5 minutes before closing to fill out the survey, please.
Here is the link to the survey on the chat.